Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to a highly fixated review of large, dense books, specifically the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts.
My name is Cody.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Will.
And this episode was supposed to be a discussion of chapters 11 and 12, but they're too fucking dense. So we have made the decision to prematurely cut this in half instead of us realizing that we've been talking to one another for 9 hours and then needing to cut the episode in half from there. So we're trying to be more proactive in the new year. Luke, you have a summary for this, correct?
I do. So we start section 2, which is called Icelandic Spar, by rejoining the Chums of Chance. They are north of the Arctic Circle, participating in a ray rush, as the earthly frontier has switched from the land to the air. The Chums are plagued by infighting and boredom, only until the arrival of their Russian counterpart and sometime nemesis, Igor Pajnatov, who informs the Chums that a zone of emergency has been declared. Chums seem to take this statement at face value. Surprisingly pleasant and helpful Igor informs the Chums that the emergency is related to an unnameable beast who feasts on the pain of its victims. Nonetheless, the Chums continue their experiments and observations. Having missed the Vormance expedition, the Chums turn north again and are soon plagued by the infamous extra man phenomenon typical for Arctic and Antarctic expeditions. They arrive at a settlement and Rudolph requests a leave. Next, we switch perspectives to a rumor-plagued ship called the Etienne Louis Malou and the residents of the harbor town where the Vormance expedition has ceased their voyage for the time being. The reader becomes acquainted with a few different local legends sourced from the time when the frontier of the Western world was the Atlantic Ocean. The expedition has set up their headquarters in the Hotel Borealis, though they do not plan to spend the winter there and are not big fans of the local cuisine. There is a short rundown of the expedition's key members. Among their number is Scarsdale Vibe's son, Fleetwood. Scarsdale is interested in possibly building a railroad that would connect Asia with North America, specifically over the Bering Strait. The expedition members monologue at one another about the death of the earthly frontier and the opening of a new frontier, the above, and next, possibly the fourth dimension. Arguments ensue. Then we follow a local painter, Hunter, as he visits a restaurant called Narvik's Mush It Away Northern Cuisine, the only restaurant in the vicinity that is open 24/7. Hunter notices that the arrangement of ice flows sometimes, though not often, mirrors the layout of canals in Venice. This fact haunts Hunter most at night while he is dreaming. The next day, Hunter has disappeared. He has gone away with the expedition, headed for parts unknown.
All right. I don't know about you guys, but this was a case where we're midway through doing this chapter for not just like reading, but the annotating and sort of research and note taking. I just thought to myself, is this the densest single chapter of any of the books that we've covered for this podcast so far? And I don't know. I think the answer might be yes. I could be wrong though. Despite that, though, I really enjoyed it. This could certainly be like my ignorance showing, given that I have not read the book before. But especially the last couple pages of this chapter feels like Pynchon is kind of elucidating one of his major sort of philosophical points of the novel, at least to me. And I think that the construction of the chapter is very impressive from the perspective of introducing sort of where the Chums of Chance kind of are, and then telling this very highly layered story of someone choosing to leave a magical realm to go off and explore sort of the modern quote unquote real world. And then all of the kind of historical context within the world of the novel that informs the background of the world he is leaving and the world that he is going to step into as a result, and what those two things mean kind of from a literary philosophical. It's just very, very impressively done. And I didn't, at times as I was reading it, always understand how Pynchon was constructing all of these elements together. But the way that he pulls them all together with that final section where we actually read about this like young man leaving this kind of special magical town, really kind of like once again proved to me how genius of a writer he is. Um, it's probably my favorite chapter so far in the book. I don't know if that's going to remain the case, but I really enjoyed this one a lot.
I'm with you 100%. It's I can remember the first time I read this. This was the second of his books that I read after I read Inherent Vice when the movie was coming out, and I remember reading the end part of this chapter, the scene of Hunter Penhallow leaving that you were just talking about. And I remember I read it and I stopped and I told my wife, I was like, this is one of the best, like just 20 something pages I've ever read. It is absolutely phenomenally written. The world building that's happening, everything that's being set up is done so intricately and so interestingly. And it's just a very, very compelling read. There's a I think a good reason that I'm with you that this is maybe this and 12 might be two of my favorite chapters in the entire book. It's and we'll talk more about 12 obviously next time, but these two chapters, just to kind of include 12 in this, it does a lot of heavy lifting to really set up, as you talked about, his sort of overall overarching themes here. There's been some of that in the previous chapters, but this is where it's really starting to shine more of a light on the thematic elements of what's going on and the sheer weight of those themes and the impact that they will have going forward. And yeah, it's probably one of the densest chapters of any of his books. I remember Luke sending out in our Discord about how long or how dense the chapter was before we had decided to split it into two and just do 11 by itself. And rereading 11 this morning, I'd read it, I think right after we talked with Johan. I read it and put it aside, and I reread it this morning. I was like, yeah, there's so much going on in here. There's no way we're gonna get through this in a short amount of time. But it was so much fun to read, and it's just it's really absorbing. And when you think back to the fact that this was probably the one book he spent the most time on in his lifetime of writing, because I think you can trace it back to around the 70s when the idea was gestating and he was starting to work on his big three stories. This seems to be the one that he was probably pouring the most effort into and wanting to really make sure everything was going to work, because there's a lot going on and it has to be very intricately tied together. And you have to make sure that everything works and that everything is going to come together in the end. And this is just a microcosm of how he could do that in this little chapter, but how he's going to do this throughout the whole book. So yeah, absolutely fantastic.
I can't even begin to, just speaking briefly on like the amount of time that he clearly put into the book and like the way that it's considered and everything. I can't even think about how it is that I would go about trying to lay this out or map this out in order to even tell the story he's telling. Because like 122 pages in from where this, chapter starts in the book, it feels like you are miles away from where you started this book at. And the amount of ground he's covering in just that 122 pages compared to like V, which I also happen to be reading at the same time, is shocking. Like the massive difference in plot density, in the construction of his overall like literary structure he's working towards the book, and all of that. It's a mind-blowing feat of just material, even if it wasn't as like well written or well produced as it is. Luke or Will, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean the prose in this section and this chapter is obviously like insanely good. I think what interested me most about this section was I think we talked a little bit in the last or the last section during our episodes in the last section about the depth of the frontier and how like the I don't think I kind of forget if we make it all the way to California in the first section. I don't think we do, but it does. The first section does kind of explore the taming of the frontier in America, and that was other than maybe Africa in the late 1800s. There weren't really any frontiers left to the Western world, and I one thing that stood out to me about like I said about this chapter is that it does seem to be like the Western frontier is closed. Everything is populated. Everything is now civilized. So it does seem like this is a depiction of civilization kind of journeying north and south to the Arctic and up into the air to search for a new frontier. And that interests me a lot. It is kind of it's Gravity's Rainbow is also kind of about that space being the final frontier. Um, So that's probably what interests me most about this is just the finding of a new frontier, the death of the old frontier, and the exploration of that.
Yeah, I mean, this may be a surprise, but I actually don't particularly like this chapter. Um, that's not to say that I have anything negative to say about it. I just don't particularly like it. Um, it is interesting though. In kind of the broader formal sense because it is the our introduction to the second part of this book, the longest part, and it is not as abrupt as Kate pointed out, a difference in density from the first chapter of the book, but compared to the last chapter of part one, it is still an intense increase in the amount of just sheer information. And it is interesting because at least from where I'm sitting right now, it feels almost like it's saying, okay, I let you have your nice easy archetypes and your nice easy stories that we are all familiar with. And sure, I threw some twists in there. Now, yep, the Earth is hollow, but it's all according to standard tropes. I you know the narrator, I guess, is who I'm impersonating here. I gave you all these the fancy numbers and the fancy um, discursive multidisciplinary BS, but now we're actually gonna do the work of this novel, and this is like a baptism of fire, I guess, into
Yeah,
that.
that's fair.
Because again, as much as I started this saying, I don't particularly like it. Like on the micro level, everything is great. I just it doesn't stand out to me, I guess, in a weird way. To me, I find it hard to connect, and not on an emotional level even, but just in a framing who they are kind of sense of Constance and Hunter Penhallow. But it's extremely exciting because there's still at least to me there's still a remaining sense of momentum from the previous chapter in the sense that we've just jettisoned through the center of the earth and we've come out on the opposite side and may have spent more time going through the tunnel than we expected, and things may have changed a little bit since entering the center of the earth, but we've still got that anticipation that I talked a lot about in the last couple chapter episodes.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and it's unclear how long it has sort of taken them to go through the center of the earth, so to speak. But you can tell that like time has progressed in a way that maybe you weren't expecting, and he does that in pretty clever way. You know,
Mhm.
one being talking about like airships being disguised using a type of camouflage that's very popular. One being the fact that Scarsdale Vibe now has a son who's never been brought up before, but who does seem decently advanced in age. It is an interesting kind of trick that he's able to pull off with seemingly to advance the time period forward while also not losing that momentum. Um, chapter.
Mhm. I think if you go off of the next chapter, I think it's a 6-year leap. It's from 1893 to 99, I think.
Mm,
I do just want to say to head off any potential gripers. I do think that Fleetwood Vibe is name dropped earlier in the book at some point, but it is just
I
he is
think,
just
I do think his
listed
name
as a
pops
name.
in. Yeah.
oh, okay.
Yes, 6 years. Page 139, Counterfly is mentioned as being bearded, and the last time we'd seen him he was boy the low rank, so 6 years.
Do we have any overall thoughts on the book, or not on the book? Any overall
Already.
thoughts
I
on
haven't done all that reading yet.
any overall thoughts on the chapter before we get into the actual?
Not really beyond what I said earlier. I do think the opening section here, the opening paragraph is phenomenal. I think
Mhm.
the wordplay that he's using here and the just detail that he's providing to set all this up, especially coming off the really kind of thrilling and exciting ending of the previous section, is really great. And there's some really funny parts in here too that I just that pinch on humor. It's so much fun to play with.
Yeah, the funniest Chums of Chance title is on not this
Yes,
page, but
it
just 2
absolutely
pages
is.
from here.
So yeah, it was a good time for me. I get where Will's coming from. I can see that point of view. But I personally really enjoyed it.
I just would like to clarify once, just to be absolutely 100% clear. I don't particularly dislike this at all. I
Right. No,
just
I know that.
yeah yeah
Just didn't resonate with you the same that it did for, I guess, the rest of us. And that's
yeah, it seems like it. But it does in a more general response. It does strike me a lot of the scenes, especially over the dinner table type stuff, remind me a lot of scenes from Mason and Dixon, but
Mhm.
written with the gravity of like Gravity's Rainbow almost, and that's just a neat thing.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. Mason and Dixon was one that came up a lot for me too, like
Yeah.
mentally, as I was reading. Looking at that first paragraph, there is a couple of lines that I want to highlight. One would be where it says, "Daily skirmishes were now being fought no longer for territory or commodities, but for electromagnetic information." Um, this feels relevant not just to the story, but also the reality that capitalism is only going to get you so far as far as what kind of markets you can
Yep.
start, or what kind of products you can create, or what kind of commodities that you can trade. Eventually, you just kind of run out of those things that people either want or need, and then you do have to sort of explore more. What is the word I think of? Like either invent new markets to operate in, or explore something more almost ethereal in the sense that, like, especially now in the modern world with internet culture having really topped out ad revenue, like
Yeah.
there's really nowhere else you can push that as far as the market goes. So now everything has just gone to personal user information, personal user data, and then also, watch time or page time. And, when you run out of these things, you do inevitably have to explore other sort of realms to create something new. And then further on down towards the end of the page, setting in motion property disputes destined to last generations, especially within what they're kind of talking about here. What the first thing that it came up for me was whatever genius, quote unquote, was able to come up with the concept of air rights whenever that started to be a thing, um, and how he could start buying up people's air rights, which would lead to property disputes. Like, okay, so you bought the ground, but do you own the air above your building? Because if you build a couple of floors higher, suddenly you're not in your territory anymore. Just
Mhm.
these very sort of absurd creations that capitalism or modern society has to come up with to kind of push the numbers higher, so to speak. Is important not just for this chapter, but I think the whole book kind of hinge on whole worldview as as a whole. But yeah, there is now something going on called the Ray Rush, where there are all of these sort of attempts to capture information or scientific readings or whatever data, so to speak, that you can actually get to see if they can kind of convert that into something else for monetary. And now different sky ships that are seeing each other in the air are supposed to be regarding one another as suspicious, and apparently battles are beginning to happen between these two types of ships, or these different countries that have their own sort of organization. And this is really where who the Chums of Chance are serving comes a bit more sharply into focus. Obviously, you don't get like a name or anything like that, but given the fact that there is a Russian counterpart that seems to be serving the behests of the Russian government, and there is certainly some Cold War illusions going on in those comparisons. It's not hard to imagine that they are serving the efforts of the U.S. government, or at the very least,
Mhm.
the interests of capital that backs the U.S. government. So you're getting a bit of a more specific look from Pinch on his part, who they may actually be working for this. And there is
So
yeah, go ahead, Will.
I'd just like to interject to kind of dissect, I guess, the real history of this,
Go for it.
because I find it interesting. There is the obvious, as the Pynchon Wiki points out, the obvious comparison to the telecom bandwidth kind of disputes, and that's obviously, I think, feeding into the writing of this book, especially the early 2000s, and even as early as the 70s and 80s era VHS, UHF stuff,
Yeah.
all very relevant. But like that's not the kind of stuff that was happening at all at the turn of the century. But what Pynchon's actually kind of doing here is in the same way that like Deep Archer was used as a like a diffuse, like a weirdly diffuse but concentrated metaphor that combined like just the general experience of spending time on the internet, or spending time in chat rooms or Wikipedia or whatever. He used like an almost RuneScape or journey like metaphor to communicate that to the reader. To also talk about things like Tor and encryption and stuff. What seems to be happening here is that he's backporting like this like hyper modern, postmodern, if you want to be weird about language, idea of auctioning off amounts of airwave, or wavelengths, into the time where what was happening was what they are claiming to be doing, which is like mapping the ionosphere, mapping the structure of the non-light EMF field, and it's just interesting. I'm not quite sure, because with Deep Archer, you have all of these concrete illusions and lines to draw, but with this, you have this just kind of taking something at least 60 years from the future and just plopping it down in the middle of a very different environment.
Yeah. Well, and especially given the fact that on page 122, it says, in small remote corners of the planet nobody was paying attention to, between factions nobody knew much about, the undeclared and largely imperceptible war had been underway for years. So it even starts before like the events of this book, so to speak, are unfolding. Like it's already ongoing. So it's even earlier. I was going to bring that up in context of translating it to the real world realities of that. Once you are somebody who is of like the capital owning class, and you have the ability to kind of finance finding these new markets or these new discoveries, and reaping the rewards of them, you can start a rush on it, like the gold rush, or whatever historical event you want to compare it to. But then by the time it kind of trickles down to the average person, all of the real monetary value there is just kind of gone already. that like
Hmm.
it is a function of how the rich stay rich, or the speculators are able to keep doing so, given the fact that they have the ability to break into these markets or these places, or research these before others can. That was sort of the only direct kind of thought I had in regards to the fact that, like, you're talking about all of this stuff is taking place 60 years before it actually is. Because certainly, you know, the average person in this version of America doesn't know what's going on at the North Pole, doesn't know about these like aerial battles that are happening, or what is potentially to be kind of reaped out of the mapping of the ionosphere. But I was going to ask you guys if you had any thoughts on what's going on here, why this is something that Pynchon is choosing to focus on, why it's earlier. So if you had any other thoughts you wanted to throw in, uh, now would be the time.
I guess the only thing I would add on is that one of the consistent things, it's not let me enunciate, not theme, things that Pynchon seems to like to do in his historical novels is to like impart a degree of self-awareness of forces impacting people that no real person ever would have had, like Scarsdale vibe talking about like collecting railroad and stuff. There's a degree of self-awareness that these power brokers are given in Pynchon's vision of the past that I think allows for them to think of like, oh, well, we're figuring out what the electromagnetic field is. Let's 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 start portioning it off already. Let's get to the chase.
Yeah.
Yeah, very, very true. This just kind of sent me down a rabbit hole, so this is the only reason I'm bringing this up. There is a brief mention to maneuvering in vessels camouflaged in naval style dazzle painting.
Yeah.
I'm sending a link in the chat to what this looks like in case you guys didn't look it up.
It's pretty awesome.
It's
is really cool.
crazy. This is something for people who are listening to this, because that's the only way you can. There is a system of camouflage that naval ships used, especially in World War One, but during kind of this general time frame, called dazzle painting, where they would paint lines or designs on it that would deliberately make it like impossible to figure out what direction the ship was heading in, especially if you were from afar, but also B, the more important part, like what side of your ship was what side of your ship. Like if you can't properly understand the direction a ship is traveling in, or what might be the stem or the stern or the bow or whatever, that massively messes up your ability to sort of plan where your torpedoes are going to go or where your attacks are going to be launched on. This led me to discover that there is a Reddit community called warship porn, where people just post cool pictures of warships. That's the whole thing. And talk about how cool boats look. Which is a very funny community to stumble across. But the one that I was able to find is like the best example I could find of what this looked like. And it's crazy. I can't imagine. It hurts my eyes just to look at in a photo.
Is a 2D image, yeah.
Yeah.
Imagine looking at that. Imagine not knowing what this was and coming upon this and the madness that would ensue, trying to figure out like, what am I looking at? What is this?
It took me an incredibly long amount of time. I literally set this image as my desktop background on my computer just because I needed to look at a larger like version of it. And it took me a really long time to realize that it was not directly the side of the boat, that you're actually looking at this photo from like a 45-degree angle, kind of at the back. It's nuts. And I'm also kind of sad that we got rid of it. I understand that with like advanced, sonar and heat-seeking technology and all that stuff, it kind of doesn't serve a purpose anymore. But imagine if all of your battleships still looked like that.
Yeah.
Be just kind of fun.
Just hit him with a razzle dazzle.
Yeah, exactly.
The dream of the razzle dazzle is alive in concept car prototypes.
Oh, is it?
Ooh.
Yeah. I've at least been fortunate enough to see a few in development car designs on the road that have the modern renditions of this, which is much more like genuine. Like it comes across in the moment as much more intentionally psychedelic.
Ooh,
Um,
okay.
I'll see if I can find any pictures of those. Although kind of the whole point of the design in that case is
It's to not. Yeah.
not be captured in a 2D image. So
Is it more like a magic eye kind of thing?
No, it's for the sake of preventing other manufacturers from
No. I mean,
stealing
is
design.
the paint they're using, does it give it more, like you said, it was more psychedelic? Does it look like those old magic eye kind of paintings?
Oftentimes, yeah. Sometimes
Okay.
it's just more that like art, that like post art deco kind of waveform.
Okay.
In
Mm.
yeah, with also like that post cubist kind of tiling nature.
Just a cool thing from history that John makes a reference to. We also get a fun pinch on acronym in the same paragraph where he comes up with an organization called the Intergroup Laboratory for Opticomagnetic Observation, or IGLOO, which is where all of the data of deepest interest to the Enterprisers convened leagues below. And in here, they make a reference to this being more like a Lloyd's of London situation in what they're using the data for. And also that he makes a reference to a fateful Lutine announcement. For those who don't know, Lloyd's of London is maybe the closest thing to a capital T they organization that operates
Yep.
in broad daylight. It is a private insurance market whose building is literally where the old East India Company offices used to be in London. And it's creepy. It's one of these things where like I could only read about it so long before I just got like a visceral feeling of ick just in
Yeah.
general between looking
Yeah.
at like the buildings, seeing all of the insurance underwriters who work for them, and just the design of the offices is like weird fusion of like old sort of 1800s aesthetic with like a futurist aesthetic. It's a weird organization. Essentially you can use them to ensure anything is sort of the
Especially like
point.
high risk stuff or things that
Yeah.
are likely to have catastrophic results. They're
Yeah.
willing to
But
ensure that.
yeah, and there's they put out like in order to like have like a fun public face for whatever sinister shit they're doing in there. They release like a list of the funniest things that they've insured that year. There is a list on Wikipedia that you can read of those. One of the most random ones I saw was they apparently insured the legs of Pat McAfee for $1 million each during his franchise tag season with the Indianapolis Colts. So they do stuff like that, but there's some sinister shit going on
Oh
in that
no, you got to
building.
have the smoke screen so that
Yeah.
no one pays attention to the real fucked up stuff that you're working with.
Yeah, 100%. The origins of and there's also like a list of like weird stuff historically that they've been involved in. Like if you
Mhm.
read through the timeline that they have on Wikipedia of like major events that Lloyd's has been sort of involved in or surrounding, it's all pretty odd how they constantly crop up. And they started as a naval insurance company primarily, in that they would insure the goods that you were shipping on, naval routes from one country to another. There's one instance in which a ship called the HMS Lutine was carrying a amount of gold. I say amount of gold because they had a fire in their offices in which a lot of their records were destroyed. They estimated like way later on that it was about $60 million worth of gold, but that's $60 million worth of gold in like whatever year this was, the 16 or
1799.
1700s. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the vessel sank because it ventured into dangerous waters that were like historically dangerous. So it's sort of not a surprise that it sank. Lloyd's actually paid out the insurance claim, which is insane that they had that much money on hand to do that back then. And then proceeded to spend nearly 150 years trying to get the gold out of the bottom of the ocean. Sometimes, contracting like regular people who had diving equipment to go down there, sometimes making petitions to the English government to go down there and get the gold, and then they would split it with them. There's a whole timeline that you can read of all of the different attempts that they tried to make between the 1799 and like literally 1938. Yeah, like they just kept trying.
Well, yeah, look what they had to pay. Somebody fucked up so bad that they were like, look, if it takes us the next 150 years, we're going to get that goddamn gold.
Yeah.
I don't know how we do it. We're going to get it. And someone's going to figure this whole thing out. And so it became the Oak Island of London.
Basically, some of the gold was recovered, like a few individual bars. One of the funniest things in this article that I did read, though, is that like they knew where the boat was. Like the wreckage didn't move; it was like stuck in place. But whoever had put the gold into barrels used like super cheap materials to hold it. So within like a couple of months of it sinking, so like if you're imagining a whiskey barrel, the metal hoops that they had on the outside of those barrels that the gold were in just like came off and the wood rotted. So all the gold just like scattered into the ocean and got swept away with the regular kind of current of the movement of the sea. They were able to recover a couple of things. They were able to recover the rudder of the ship, which they then turned into a desk and a chair that I guess is still utilized to this day for like important board meetings. Like the president of Lloyd's will sit in it to kind of give updates on the company to effectively like shareholders. They have an inkwell from the captain's desk, and then the most famous thing, the thing that Pynchon makes reference to, is the lutine bell. It's the bell from the ship that, for some reason, the name on the bell doesn't match the ship name. No one's ever been able to figure out why that is. And they used to use it as like an announcement bell. So if there was ever a ship that was lost or became overdue at its port, they would ring the bell once if it was a disaster, and the ship was like lost, and they were gonna have to pay out the insurance claim. They would ring the bell twice if the ship arrived safely and all of the cargo was recovered. They did that practice for a really long time until eventually the bell developed a crack in it, and the last time it was rung was 1980. And that was a two-bell situation. The last time it was rung once was, I think, like 1973, something along those lines. So, yeah, it's it's one of these things that Pynchon throws in there that is legitimately a funny joke, but you can also spend a significant amount of time reading about what he's actually making reference to.
Well, and I've got more layers to add onto it.
Okay.
There's the Lloyd's, which is explicit, and there's the reference that is pointed out by Pynchon Wiki again to the high frequency active auroral research program in Gakonka, Alaska. What is not mentioned that actually lines up kind of alongside the HARP, the high frequency active auroral research program acronym with Igloo is ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which is the organization which decides what domain names are supposed to look like on the internet and helps organize trying to avoid going into actual technical detail, but helps organize like broad agreement between like IP designations and stuff for different geographical regions. Which again, just to jump back to the actual historical science that was happening at this point in time, was, naming the spectrum, naming what happened in the spectrum, what different phenomena happened at different latitudes, and between ICANN and the HARP, that is kind of a perfect analogy for what Igloo is doing, and that's just a delightful one of those delightful details that shows off the amount of work that Kate was talking about went into this book.
After a quick sort of back and forth between a couple of the people who work at Igloo, we then get a lovely detail that that Pugnax's tail is used in their telegraphy equipment. Just a fun piece of info on how their ship works. And just after they hear Pugnax's tail beating, they realize it is because a suspicious ship has been spotted out in the mists of the ether, and it turns out that it is the flagship of, quote, Randolph's mysterious Russian counterpart and far too often nemesis, Captain Igor Padzitnov. Apologies for mispronunciation. With whom previous, quote unquote, run-ins, see particular The Chums of Chance and the Ice Pirates, or my favorite book title, The Chums of Chance nearly crash into the Kremlin, invoked in the boys' lively though anxious memory.
I love that
Such
one.
an absurd title. The parallel organization, as they're referred to in St. Petersburg, I'm not going to attempt to say those words in Russian because I am not confident, can be translated to accidental comrades, which might as well mean chums of chance.
Mhm.
So even these other organizations just sort of all have a similar name. I also some more details with this that are quite funny. That the name of the captain shares the last name, though not the same spelling, with the creator of Tetris, which ordinarily would be like, just sort of a random throwaway thing. But then it goes on to say that their own specialty being to arrange for bricks and masonry, always in the 4-block fragments which had become his signature, to fall on and damage targets designated by his superior. This lethal debris was generally harvested from the load-bearing walls of previous targets of opportunity. Um, it's just such a funny joke. This chapter is really great. I remarked on this to my partner as I was like reading and taking notes, and that Pynchon, I think, understands when he's being really difficult or like really layered in what he's writing, and kind of giving his reader a challenge, because he usually follows it up with like jokes or an easier
Mhm.
chapter. And this chapter has a beginning and at the end of the chapter, and that in the beginning you learn about Tetris Man flying around in the sky. And then at the end of this chapter you get the joke about the Mush It Away restaurant, which is also equally pretty funny.
Uh.
So it's a great kind of curve that this chapter takes. Any thoughts on their Russian counterpart before we get into his warning?
I love all of that whole scene, starting with
Yeah.
Pugnax and his tail being the gong of it, as I think is it described, something like that. But yeah, it's it's one of those things where this is where I really would love to see like a film adaptation or a miniseries adaptation of this, just to see that scene and see Randolph's face as this guy approaches. He's like, "Oh, Jesus, not this fucking guy again," and then just having to deal with it, and just the Tetris imagery killed me. I had to put the book down for a second because I was just laughing my
Mhm.
ass off.
Yeah, I was not expecting there to be an actual follow-up on the Tetris, because I read it and I was like, "Wait a second, isn't that the?" Because there was a movie about the Tetris founder a
Mhm.
couple years ago that I don't know why I watched it, but I did. And and then suddenly it got followed up with that paragraph. Great. Yeah,
Uh,
lovely joke.
the the layers of the joke go even deeper, because there's the historical context of the name of the ship, the Bolshaya Igra, the great game. But I'm not interested in that. It's a good game, Tetris. It might
Yeah,
be
it
the
is.
best game.
It's up there.
Yeah, there's an argument for that.
No, there's no argument. It's settled.
It's- it is written. It is on this episode. Cannot be argued.
You heard it here first, everybody.
Yes.
The
It is
best
known.
game, board or video, is Tetris. Or card. Did you have more to say about the name of the ship, or was that it?
No, that's it. I just think
Oh, okay.
no one talks about that. Like, if you go online and look at people talking about this book, they'll happily talk about how the great game was the name of this specific series of events that happened in Central Asia, and know how it parallels what happened around the same time in Africa. But that's not interesting to me. Tetris is interesting. Now, that's something I can really sink my teeth into.
True enough. You can
Dig my thumbs in on.
Forever. Yeah. When the ship pulls alongside very violently to the inconvenience, which elicits an "oh gravy" from Randolph, which I don't think I'll ever have a reason to say that, but there is a part of me that wishes that I was the kind of person who, when they need an exclamation, they say "oh gravy." And the response that they get from the Russian guy is "ahoy balloon boys."
That's what I'm talking about. This guy, they've got to hate him.
Is just annoying. He has flaxen hair and he's athletic and he's chirpy. And then they have this sort of weird interaction in which he warns them that there's been a zone of emergency declared, and that Igloo's involved in that process. And then he makes an offhand reference to this animal with no name that is like the most violent of all of the animals. And after giving them this warning, he just kind of leaves. So what do we? It may be something that comes along or is relevant later in the book. I don't know. What do we think about this interaction between Randolph St. Cosmo and his Russian counterpart?
I've always connected this to chapter 12 and what they end up capturing is probably not the best word, but what they are found to be dealing with towards the end of chapter 12. I think this is him kind of warning them of that your people are playing into some pretty dangerous avenues, and you might want to be careful because they're starting to get into waters that might be a little bit too deep.
Mm-hmm.
I do also love the fact that he gives this like really dark portent of what's to come. And Lindsay's response is, "Goodness, all we did was ask."
It is pretty funny.
It's a great little bit of character / allegory to have Lindsay just completely miss the point of that.
Yeah.
Just take it as a threat.
Kind of alluded to in the summary, I do find it interesting that they don't question Igor at all about this, because if I was, prospecting for gold, say, and my nemesis came up and told me there's a bear in the area, you got to get out. I wouldn't necessarily be like, oh, I believe you. I'd maybe think I was onto something or that there was something else going on.
Mm-hmm.
Which that could just speak to the chums. They're younger. That kind of stuff may not occur to them, but they seem to take it at face value, and kind of. I mean, they still, I guess, stay in the area for the time being. They're up in the air, and I don't think that the creature is supposed to be able to fly and stuff. But yeah, I just find it interesting that they didn't question it at all, and that maybe Igor. I mean, how's he described? It's like something either counterpart and far too often nemesis. So the counterpart part, that maybe speaks to them having similar missions or something. But the nemesis part, I would if my nemesis warned me about something, I would probably question it at least some.
Do you have a nemesis, Luke?
Let me think. I mean, not really. I guess if any nemesis I would have would probably not necessarily like a big feature of my life because I avoid them. But
Well, but they would have to make it known. That's their whole goal, is to just upend
Mhm.
your life. So they have to interfere with it as much as possible.
That's true. That's true. So I guess I don't have one. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good.
Um, I guess the reason that doesn't surprise me, Luke, to I guess to imply a question. The reason it doesn't surprise me that very much is that at this moment, like what you have is physically it's like a naval parlay where two captains are talking to each other, where there's always the assumption of good faith, because otherwise you can't do naval warfare without it, because otherwise piracy would just be a completely intractable problem instead of a mostly intractable one. Um, but what they're doing, what both of these airships are doing, is information gathering. It's like in any number of spy novels or movies or TV shows, you're not going to have the spies questioning each other's narratives to their faces unless they're trying to get something out of it. You just have to take their words for what they are and try to understand why they would be trying to get you out of the area. And if there isn't a reason, then you can disregard the idea that they're just deceiving you. And it's, like Tajidnov says, they're relentlessly innocent. They're gonna keep on going wherever they went. They're not gonna heed his warnings. And I don't take him at face value, or at least I'm not in this reading, going through this book, because I don't think he's lying per se. But I do get the sense that, yeah, no, that he wouldn't just drop by to share that information, because if Igloo is broadcasting that, then they would have access to it, one would
Mhm.
imagine. But maybe not. And it's just one of those unresolvable things.
There could also be some like gesturing toward the kind of weird relationship that Russia and America had. That like the average people sort of on the front line, so to speak, of the Cold War were maybe annoyed by what like the other side was doing, but they didn't really have much of a reason to genuinely hate the other side or to like hold anything deeply against them. Like, yes, there was this overwhelming sort of threat of nuclear annihilation from both ends, but there was no actual like attack or like war that was being fought. And there were times that the two countries had to kind of reluctantly work together or acknowledge each other's progress in a way that made any kind of interaction between them really tough. So he could also be playing on that. Because, there would have been times where intelligence or information would have been shared between those two countries during the Cold War, and then it would have been a whole nightmare of like, is this deliberate misinformation? Is this something that we can actually trust or use? What the fuck do we do with this? So there could be also some thematic gesturing in that direction.
And that also reminds me of the U.S. Russia relationship, or the West, like maybe not just the U.S. Russia relationship in World War II, but the relationship between Russia and Western Europe and America in World War II, where they were allies, ostensibly allies, but by the end of the war, like the Cold War had begun, and they were each side was racing to take over parts of Germany and racing for, as is depicted in Gravity's Rainbow, like racing for technology and intel and stuff, where like they were kind of frenemies, you know.
Yeah, very true.
Yeah, and if they are truly nemesis, which, as we've discussed, clearly are, what would be Hadji, what would be his purpose without Saint Cloud?
What does the Joker do in the absence of Batman?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Musical.
Oh
But
God, yeah. Why did you have to remind me that's a thing that exists?
I really wanted to distract.
Ugh.
I was just waiting for the day
Christ.
when Joker Foliado came up on the podcast.
My favorite movie of 2024.
That is
Finally
so
happened.
strange. Yep. such a strange. Just this is really carbon dating this episode in a way that we don't generally do. I don't think, but just the oddity of that film existing as the sequel to a movie that made $1 billion, which is also crazy. Is what a strange creation that is.
I do buy that it was a prank.
Given that Todd
yeah.
Phillips said from the get-go he never wanted to do a sequel. Yeah, that seemed like a big just like let's waste the studio's money as well as possible.
Why else would you let Joaquin Phoenix rewrite the script while you were filming? Oh man. Anyway, the boys enter into this sort of zone of emergency, and then after a page break, we return with the boys turning north at an area of West Iceland, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that name or multiple other names that are going to come up in this chapter. I love hearing the language of Icelandic and the Nordic countries. I cannot speak it though. We then get a reference to this idea of the extra man of the Arctic suddenly coming on a board. It says, this is a familiar story. The book refers to this as being a familiar story up here meaning the Arctic. For those who don't know, that this is a real phenomenon. No one really knows why this happens. It is sometimes known as the third man factor. It's been experienced by a lot of people who are polar explorers, solo sailors around the world, shipwreck survivors, and also like mountain climbers in particular as well. Ernest Shackleton wrote about seeing an additional man in his 1919 book South. More modern examples would be Reinhold Messer, Peter Hillary, and Anne Bancroft. Joe Simpson wrote about it in Touching the Void. It's a pretty famous book about a mountain climbing incident that he underwent, and that this third man in particular pushed him to crawl back to his camp when he thought he was out of energy. The term third man factor actually comes from a book by that title, published by a guy named John G. Geiger, in which he recounts like dozens and dozens of experiences. That quote, in fact, from the Ernest Shackleton book, was later repurposed into The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. Cody, you pulled the quote here. Do you want to read it?
Sure. In the section in The Wasteland reads, "Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look ahead up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you."
And it's just sort of this strange thing that happens. No one is really sure why. Some scientific sort of explanations or theories around it think that it may be a coping mechanism for like situations of sort of extreme stress, where in order to find a reason to keep pushing forward or keep moving towards safety or salvation, as it may be, your brain may sort of export the thought processes required to do that to this sort of imaginary third figure. Apparently, it's also been used in psychology and psychological therapy, where they have tried to sort of illustrate the third man, so to speak, as like the inner self, and then you talk to it, or receive sort of wisdom from your inner self or something like that. What kind of therapists are engaged in that, I can't find. But apparently, it is a practice that it's not just one of these kind of like weird human things that occurs. And the chums are in a situation where their ship is kind of blown off course, and so they have to work double time, so to speak, to get it back in the direction they're looking to go. And suddenly this third appears. But it's not the first instance in this chapter in which a voice or sort of person from somewhere else shows up. Another kind of voice that nobody can find the source of comes into play in the discussion group later. But more so than the third man factor, there is this line. At times, one of the boys would understand, too late, of course, that the face he thought he was dealing with was not in any way the true face, or even one he recognized. What do we make of that line? Does anyone have any thoughts or theories on what Pynchon is gesturing at there?
Well, first things first. The third man is obviously Jesus.
Oh, I thought you were
Just-
going to say Orson Welles.
I thought you were going to say Harry Lime.
Yeah, Harry Lime, Orson Welles. Yeah, same difference.
but I mean,
That's why there's only one set of footprints.
exactly.
I swear I carried.
Duh. I don't know. It is an interesting phrasing of that sentence because it really does feel like it's trying to get at something in particular that is not obvious to me, at least, because the extra man of the Arctic, like, I guess it kind of it implies either that there's a true face to the extra man, or that there is I just don't know, because what is another interpretation of the true face in specific to this context, I guess.
Perhaps this is where we turn it over to the larger group, being the organization of listeners.
Yeah.
If you guys have any thoughts on what Pynchon might be trying to say there, please let us know, because we don't have any. From there, we find the inconvenience does eventually arrive at the little settlement they're looking for. Randolph St. Cosmo grants ground leave to the crew at that point, with the warning or note that these are a northern people. They're not likely to mistake us for gods or anything, not like those customers back in the East Indies that time. And the narrator has the temerity to withdraw all of the potential jokes for a title of a different Chums of Chance adventure that must have happened there. I would love to know what occurred in which a group of indigenous people thought that, like, Chick Counterfly was a god, or any of the other crew members of the ship were gods. That would be crazy. From there, they mention that they have brought along a sort of local rock or ore or like object, and it is explained as being called blue ivory, preserved bones of real prehistoric mammoths, not the tinted bonzoline you see further south. This is a miniature copy of an Inukshuk that actually stands upon a ridgeline far away in the interior, meaning the hollow earth. Rocks piled in roughly the shape of a human, not to threaten the stranger, but to guide him in a country where landmarks are either too few or too many to keep straight. And then this is sort of the first reference to rocks or minerals or something of that kind being used for guidance. Iceland Spar is going to come into play a lot towards the end of this chapter, and the historical context around some of that is that there is a very good reason to believe that Iceland Spar is the sunstone that Vikings talked about, which they used for navigational purposes when they couldn't directly see the sun. So just another thing to keep in mind, which I am bringing up not only because it is important, but also it supports a later theory I have about some of this stuff philosophically that's going on in this chapter. Any thoughts on this brief stopover for ground leave before we get into the story that takes up a majority of this chapter?
I do have to bring up that the wiki mentions that bonzoline was an ivory substitute made from celluloid that was used for billiard balls.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read that, my mind immediately went back to
Yep.
that scene, and I had a real good chuckle.
Yep, same thing happened to me. And then after I recovered from the chuckle of remembering, wow, nice break.
Nice break.
I then realized, Jesus Christ, not only is that the same book as this, but that was less than 100 pages ago.
Yep.
Which is really crazy considering where this particular story is placing us at now.
Blue ivory is a real thing. It's a real phenomenon. You can buy it, although oftentimes well-intentioned, ivory trade bans get in the way of getting a hold of it if you're a craft person, for example. But I do recommend any people who are interested in fetish items, keep their eyes out, because blue ivory is just beautiful and it's cool. But also, I just would like to clarify. I do think that at the top of 126, when the unnamed speaker is talking about the interior, I do think they're talking about the normal surface of the earth, because in order to survive in either Viking or in Inuit or Eskimo cultures, you have to basically stay on coastlines, and so they have a specific concept of navigation where there's inland and there's seaward, and that's just the general way of navigation in the way that we would use north or south.
Fair, yeah. You're spotlighting interior in sort of Department of the Interior terms, the center of a country, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, it's geographical. It's not a metaphor.
Yeah.
But yeah.
No, yeah. Just in the sense that is also what that word in that context means.
No, yeah, and I thank you, Pension, for overloading everything with puns.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Which is, and it's also interesting because there's a lot of stuff in the later portion of chapter 11 where what is interior in this sort of Hollow Earth point of view versus very much just really, really far north gets kind of twisted and moved around a lot, to where they almost merge into a certain way. So that's good context to add, certainly. That
What do you mean almost?
Yeah, I guess it just sort of does happen rather than almost happening. Any other thoughts before we go right into Penunga Gap?
I just like the idea of so Inukshuk are described sufficiently on the Pynchon wiki. They are little cairns that look like human bodies from a distance, and the idea of like people from quote unquote civilized society coming to northern territories and saying, "Oh, gee, I sure do feel overwhelmed and lost in my day-to-day life in London. I should buy a tiny little statue of a man. That'll help me. That'll help keep me grounded."
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. For those who are particularly interested in Inukshuk, there is one on the flag of Nunavut.
Oh, that's cool.
It was also the logo for the 2010 Olympic Winter Games in Vancouver. They the like little kind of design that they did for that was depicting Inukshuk. They're pretty cool things. Okay, so that's where we get into a nested story.
That's the less dense part of this chapter.
So to kind of like lay out the land, so to speak, before we actually map the zone, there is an explanation of what the Etienne Louis Malou is, and then from there we get a explanation of where the boat is going in context of the partially real but partially mythological voyages of Harold the Ruthless, one of the lesser kings of Norway, but the last kind of important Viking king before that age ended. And then we transition to somebody living in the space that Harold was sailing towards in contemporary time to the book. And then we zoom back out to the ship itself and a discussion group taking place on the boat, and then back to that insert character in the place that Harold was sailing to, and then the chapter ends. So that's sort of roughly the structure that Pynchon is working with. Again, as someone who is a published author, that's crazy. And it took me quite a bit to see how he was layering this together, and I could not imagine the mental energy I would have to expend to attempt to do the same thing. It's very impressive.
Yeah.
When it comes to the like how one would design this chapter, I do think that like these kinds of things feel very much like kind of an intuitive process
Mhm.
more than anything that's mapped at all. And if anyone has spent time on just to point again to the largest individual space, the Pynchon wiki, and gets annoyed when people are like, oh, they're not novels, they're Minuthian satires. This is actually what they mean. It's not about like the idea of novel as like some specific. It's not like it's not saying this is better or like something bigger than a novel. It's that like formally this is not a narrative. This is not a story about a person or a group of people. This is like an epic length prose satirical poem, and
Mhm.
it just is that there. And I don't know if there's any way you can look at these books, the big ones at least, as true novels. Maybe Mason and Dixon.
Yeah, if one of the three of them is, I would say it's certainly that one.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that it does feel intuitive because I should clarify. When I talk about trying to break these things down in my head, I am very much trying to do it from the perspective of a writer in the sense that like if I had to come up with how to do something like this or like if I had to come up with how to lead a reader through the structure that I'm creating, that is very difficult. I can't necessarily understand how to begin to do that, especially when you're nesting multiple things together. It is written in a way that, from the reader's perspective, you can tell he's putting all of this together towards an endpoint, and it does feel intuitive in how some of these things flow together. But certainly from a macro view of how you would construct to write something like this, it is very difficult to break down and understand or to intuitively think about. But that doesn't get in the way of the ability to read it or enjoy it.
No,
Yeah.
I do mean it from the author perspective, and it might be
Mm,
just as you know, I'm going through the Mahabharata at the moment, and so
sure.
I'm deep in this like mindset of reading something that was built up through an oral tradition over decades and centuries, and eventually compiled into something pseudo homogeneous, and it's just like it does feel like there is a mode that poets will tend towards far more than prose authors, where it is
Mhm.
the ideas are coming together, and they can't be put in the same phrase, so you just have to put them one after another and dispense with the idea of linear narrative, I guess. I don't
Sure.
know.
Yeah.
I don't think
And
this
that
is
could
useful for anyone listening to this show, but conversation.
well, if you want to understand the context behind how Thomas Pinchot is like ordering this stuff, I would say it is relevant.
Maybe.
Um because that is, I mean, that is good detail. That is one case where admittedly my reading experience is pretty low. Um, I've read like some of the major epic pieces of poetry, but not any of the stuff at the level that you're talking about. Even, the Talmud for all of that I've read is not necessarily structured the same way. There's a lot of folklore in there, but it's mainly a group of old rabbis arguing about the meaning of a sentence in that self-contained folklore for several pages, rather than it
Yeah.
being anything sort of how you're describing.
Yeah, no, I think a more familiar analogy would be like to the Iliad or something, where
Sure.
Homer will start singing to the muse, and the muse will respond back, but obviously it's still Homer speaking, and you have like these grand what's the term, but the grand metaphors of Homer that are used as like we talk about them today as like a mnemonic, but it is also kind of a demonstration of the way that as Pynchon constantly talks about the idea of time being purely modern, or at least the way we think about time.
Mhm.
because the importance of these figures is taking up space in the poem. It's not just the action that's happening. It is the importance of the action that is also being represented, I guess.
All great context, for sure. So we learned that this particular ship, named for a Napoleonic army engineer and physicist, who in late 1808, looking through a piece of Iceland spar at the sunset reflected from the window of the Luxembourg Palace, discovered polarized light. That is actual history surrounding the namesake of the boat. Of course, the rest of what we learn about the namesake of the boat and the boat itself is not. But he is taking a nugget of real history and kind of extrapolating out. This boat decided to sail north on a long voyage to the coasts of quote unquote Iceland. Don't let the fact that there is a real country named that get in the way of the fact that that is not where they are.
Mm-hmm.
When the book says Iceland, the book is telling you this is a land of ice, literally. Not in the sense that Iceland is very cold. They are not actually living and walking around on pieces of ice. Whether or not the ice is bad does not inform the people who live in Iceland in their decisions of whether they can go to dinner. This is very much a different place that is simply made out of ice. We get kind of a pinch-on song, kind of in the sense that it's a singular verse.
Mm-hmm.
And also, it has been a very long time since there was another one. I am loving the lack of music in this book comparative to a lot of his others. And at this point, we hear about some of the different sort of rumors and banter going on between members of the crew. Some of which could be references to Moby Dick or other sort of works of sort of sailing literature. We get some more references to Iceland Spar, like the crystal, and that there may be these sources up north that are so big that it's just like one huge piece of Iceland Spar, cave just of Iceland Spar, and then eventually a lot of this leads us to a mention of a woman named Constance Penhallow. Several people on the Pinch-On wiki get in a fight over what her last name means. Did anyone else notice that the Pinch-On wiki for this chapter, there's a lot of infighting happening between the people who are contributing to it?
I think we brought this up in an earlier episode about.
Well,
I don't
there's
remember
been
what
a
it was
lot
about
for this
specifically,
book
but
in total.
yeah, this is like the
Comparative-
one where people just seem to lose focus of talking about the historical things that are in here and just start nitpicking at each other's ideas.
And then one guy in here tells the story of how embarrassed he was that he asked an actual Nordic person if meat Olaf is a real dish, which is a crazy thing to do. Not just to ask that story, but then to also put it
publish it
on Wiki. I think that probably the best way to interpret her name, at least for my money anyway, is the idea that she is close to holiness, in the sense that her surname means near holy, close to holy, or close to sacred, something like that. Where the origins of that name come from a cultural perspective, I don't think really inform anything more, especially in consideration of the fact that she is largely there to be present to watch her grandson sleep. Or nephew, I don't remember exactly their relation to one another. Grandson. So I think that her last name translating to that close to holy or near sacredness has to do more with the place that she is from or the place that she is living than it does, with her moral character, right? But I could be wrong. Perhaps she is revealed to be quite a special lady later in the book. I have not read Against the Day before. But we learn that that she lives in this place that the boat is sailing to with her grandson Hunter. And then from there we go to Tales of Harold the Ruthless, son of King Sigurd, sailing north, drawn by inexplicable desire. Harold the Ruthless is a real guy. Now, as someone who is someone who's has a more than passing interest in Norse paganry, I'm going to modify the stuff that we are going to talk about with Harold with the fact that you cannot trust Snorri Snorlason.
Even though it's a
He
really
is-
good name.
It's a great name.
It's a
It's an
great name.
absolutely great name. Snorri Snorlason is the historian from antiquity that we have most of the sources for the Viking Age and the Viking sagas from. He is also remarkably biased in the stuff that he wrote and published and the way that he took the stories of his own people, as far as, the area of the world he came from, to fit within a Christian context. Snorri Snorlason would tell you that Harold was a very heavily Christian guy and that he was very sort of responsible for spreading Christianity. Some modern historians have claimed that maybe that is not true, that Harold may have had a connection to Christianity because of where he was from and the people groups that he worked with and the different sort of like social alliances or ancestral alliances he had that made him think that he'd take over England, but that it was largely sort of allies of convenience rather than any sort of like deep held conviction in the belief in God and in Jesus. What is important to know about Harold is that he is pretty much the last guy in the Viking Age before it turns historically into the Christian age. So, regardless of his connection to Christianity in his personal life, his death after his failed attempt to invade and take over England does sort of represent the end of the kind of heathen age and the Viking age. And that is more important from the perspective of sort of the difference between the two different worlds that this chapter is kind of traversing between. That, like, with his passing, something else passed out of the world, so to speak. Cody, it looks like you did some more research on him. Do you want to share some of the stuff that you pulled out?
Yeah, so he was responsible for, and I think his last name was Hardrada. I think that's right. Outside of the, I guess, speculation as to his role with Christianity and involvement with it, he was actually pretty majorly responsible for developing a Norwegian currency, which was largely based on a coin-based system that really opened the doors for them to have international trade and commerce with other countries that were around them. He was known, at least from what I've seen, he was known for being quite brutal, in that he would kind of ruthlessly punish people whenever he felt it necessary. He wasn't really seen as a gentle king or anything in that kind of context. He was kind of not on the level of someone like maybe Vlad the Impaler, but he was certainly someone who wasn't afraid to use whatever violence he felt necessary to get across whatever he needed to get across. And he may have been seeking Vinland at the last of his travels, which at the time would have just recently been discovered and started to be reported over in Europe. So that definitely ties into a lot of the themes of not just this work, but also with Mason and Dixon and the ties that it has to Vinland. So pretty interesting connections. And I wasn't aware of the sort of dispute over his role with Christianity. That's rather interesting.
Yeah, it's without talking for the next like hour and a half about the religious history of my own like familial line outside of being Jewish. There's a lot of sort of grave robbing, so to speak, that happened culturally with Christianity over Nordic people. Not just through Snorri's sagas, but just the way in which Christianity shaped its own like celebrations and its own kind of like liturgical calendar in a way to make it easier to convert Nordic peoples because they were really one of the holdout resistors for quite a long time. And yeah, so like a lot of people do think that he was very Christian and that he worked actively to it. And then some modern historians who are smarter than I have called that into question.
Impression I get is that Snorri was a lot like Tacitus or
Yeah, very
Churchill.
much so.
They told history. They didn't necessarily tell truth.
Yeah, absolutely true. There is a line in here in which it mentions that tales of Harold the Ruthless, son of King Sigurd, sailing north, drawn by inexplicable desire, farther away each sunset from all comfort, all kindness, to the awful brink, scant oar strokes away from falling into Gunungagap, the lightless abyss, glimpsed through the northern obscurities, reported on over the years by lost fisherfolk, marauders, god-possessed fugitives. Harold threw over his threw over his men, backed their oars, the fateful circumference wheeling past them through the fog. Harold Hardrad, having come about just in time, understood from that moment of unsought mercy with the end of the world now at his back, more than perhaps he cared to about desire, and the forsaking of desire and submission to one's duties to history and blood. This has some foundation in reality. He he was kind of an unsuccessful ruler in the sense that he never fully took over Norway. He tried to become the sole king of Norway several times, didn't really work. Like I said, he tried invading England, and that was where he died. But he did have a very big interest in exploration, especially the uplands and the sea beyond. There is a book called the Gesta Hammerbergensis Ecclesiae Pontificum by Adam of Bremen that is referenced in this book as well. This book being Against the Day. It is a real thing in which it does mention the idea that he did go northern in his ships, and then when he finally reached what Adam of Bremen calls failing boundaries, he barely escaped the deep abyss. It is unclear what any of that means in reality, right? Like this is this is all very strange ancient sources, and who knows what he may have found, who knows where he may have gone. He could have just come back and been, completely boasting about his own achievements, and maybe he didn't see anything. But Gunungagap is a very real thing from Norse mythology. Uh, it is in Old Norse a word that means gaping abyss, and in a mythological context, it refers to sort of the emptiness before sort of creation came out of it. Is the easiest way I can kind of describe it. It's this void between sort of the physical realm that humans live in and the realm of the Aesir and the Vanir, and where all of that sort of more mythological celestial stuff comes from. And if we're looking at this in a context of all of the other stuff we've talked about within this book, and then some in Mason and Dixon, of exploration and kind of filling in the gaps on a map, and sort of the more that you advance map making and modernity as a whole, the more that kind of magic starts to fade away. There is an idea that as soon as Harold's sort of went on this voyage and saw that kind of magic, it filled something in, not just in the real world physically, which is where Constance Penhallow is, but also something within himself that he kind of realized that he made a mistake and that he should just go back. And that was sort of from an age and a time in which the idea of this sort of mystical realm or this inherent magic or Edenic nature to creation and the landscape was very much respected. And especially if you go through the sagas and the Prose Edda or the Poetic Edda and all of these different things that you pull some of this mythological context from, that the idea of the veneration of the land, the idea of the veneration of the spirits and the sort of inherent magic of the land is a huge part of what this culture in particular believed in and really weaved into their sort of societal fabric and to their identity. So it makes absolute sense that that he would realize that he made a mistake and then come home and kind of never return, and then also potentially force his own men overboard to kind of keep some of this stuff a secret. But of course, once you've sort of taken the genie out of the bottle or removed the toothpaste from the tube, you really can't undo that. And so it just took a more modern world to kind of pick up where he left off, so to speak. Um, Anyone have anything else they want to add to that overarching concept of the herald portion of this?
So it's not necessarily related to exactly this portion. It's actually jumping back a bit. But I
Okay.
think that what you elucidated there goes a long way to justifying the inclusion of something that I was just going to leave on the cutting room floor. Basically, the
I love when that happened.
basically the in the earlier it's just a page earlier. Sitting here scrolling through pages. No, the previous page where Randolph is saying, "Look, everyone, they're not going to think that we're gods like those Pacific Islanders did." I take that as an interesting kind of wry poke at what I think a lot of contemporary to us um, religious anthropologists will tend to frame the kind of distinctions between equatorial and polar belief systems. And I find the entire idea of like a Western sailor coming by to an island is treated as a god is one of those interesting overinflated ideas, and having the contrast of your kind of discussion of what mythical ideas might have been fueling Harold's plans kind of supplies the other side of that.
Yeah, definitely.
The only other thing is that I think it's obvious that Gunungaga that Harold the Ruthless saw was Atlantis having shifted the polar, or not the polar, having shifted the North Pole as it sank into the sea, and the water just hadn't realized it yet, so it was holding up its end of the deal.
Mm-hmm. The book is also very explicit in the idea that what Harold did kill the sort of majesty of this. There's a quote in here that says, "Already by the time of Harold, the once terrible void was scarcely a remnant." So this idea that this yawning mouth of chaos, that out of it is birthed the land and everything else, that's already kind of gone by the time he shows up. It's certainly gone by the time that they have like steamships and everything that's happening in the book. So Thomas Pynchon is sort of, I think, using a lot of these mythological contexts, not just to kind of provide an anchor for the stuff that he's talking about, so it's not all just fictional stuff he's coming up with, but also to add a degree of not only structure but also complexity, while being very clear to his reader in a way that he's not always been in his career as a writer, what he's trying to say. And I think he's very successful. It's kind of interesting reading both V and this book at the same time, because it really does illustrate the like leaps and bounds he made as a writer in his quality, not just from a perspective of his readability, but also from a perspective of how it is that he fuses his ideas with the text itself. It's just perfect. I have no notes on how it is that he's elucidating these thoughts that he has, and these kind of ideas that are underpinning this book as a whole. From there, we get a mention that the Penhallow family made a lot of money from Iceland Spar, and that they have access to these extensive deposits all over the Arctic, which are sort of the same kind of deposits that the sailors of the expedition were sort of whispering about. This idea that there may be these caves and these caverns of massive ore deposits of just Iceland Spar. And then from there, we go back to the Vormans expedition after all of that crazy mythological stuff that's so cool, and I love to see a portion of my heritage represented accurately on the page in a way. Very neat. When the expedition
You're a Welsh
arrived,
robber baron? Or sorry, Cornish,
Yeah.
not Welsh.
absolutely, yes. My great grandfather was a not he wasn't a robber baron, he was a carpetbagger. There's an important distinction there.
You're right. Take it back.
We learned that as soon as sort of the ship arrived, her grandson Hunter, she kind of just knew he was gone. And this gets into the kind of tragic element of this chapter, but also again this concept that Pynchon is working with of these two different worlds, the one of sort of the interior and the magic and mystery and inherent beauty of the world, and then the kind of exterior, I love how he puts it, quote unquote, real world of
Mhm.
modernity and science and invention, and how there is enough seduction in that world that if you have the right mindset, like Hunter likely does, you will want to go after it thinking that is something sort of worth your time, worth your investment, only to then sort of have a bait and switch thrown on you when you realize that actually you're just going to become a wage slave, and get thrown into this machine that you don't even know. There is a degree to this section that makes me think about what it must have been like for the indigenous tribes of like South America to see giant sailboats from Spain show up, and just how crazy that would have been mentally to deal with. It's just it is part of what makes this chapter so good, and it's part of what he has been doing for this whole book, where he takes these big high concept ideas that he's working with, but then he anchors them very directly in like familial circumstance. Do we have any thoughts before the end of this page?
I do like the mention of the Penhollows being essentially the vibes of that area. It's not
Yeah.
implied that there is evil as vibe, but they are certainly
No.
responsible for this imbalanced wealth that they and access to a valued source material that they have, and the impact that can have, and it's sort of subtle statement of that, of just kind of sneaking it in there for one or two sentences and then just kind of moving on. Really, just kind of lay some interesting foundation work for them.
Agreed. But it also gives you it's not just foundational work, but it's also another, now that you mention that, another method of comparison between the two worlds.
Yeah,
The fact that Vibe and his ilk, when they have that money, that amount of money, they're just in constant pursuit of more of it, and are in constant pursuit of like continuing to build themselves up. When if you didn't know that they had access to these giant mines filled with Iceland spar, it just seems like a normal grandmother living
Yeah.
in a house full of books with her grandson who likes to paint.
Yeah.
That there is certainly a degree of corruption that is not present in this world that is present in other.
Definitely a contrast to vibe, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. From there, we get a sort of moment in which we learn a bit more about Hunter and the fact that painting, that he's attempting to paint sort of this building and the hotel and the expedition headquarters and all of that. Very fascinated by this world that he previously has not had any association to. We also get the first reference to Venice, which is going to be a bigger thing at the end of this chapter. But then we get some more banter between members of the expedition, including the reference to Meat Olaf, which don't ask your Norwegian or Scandinavian friends if this is a real dish. It is meatloaf.
Wait, what? Huh?
Oh no, he spoiled it.
Oh my god!
it's a meatloaf just of herring. There's no beef. It's just sort of cured fish. Yeah, it's just a funny throwaway joke. And then we get a reference to an ancient salsa that you'd buy at a dollar store. This is one part of American life that I have really never understood. The like weird
The spice obsession.
salsas. Yeah, like with
Yeah.
the weird salsas and hot sauces that like really aren't intended for human consumption.
No,
Like you can,
it's like a bizarre contest to see who can
yeah,
outdo the other one. Yeah, no, I don't get it either. As someone who's, I love salsa. I love a good salsa.
Yeah.
But there is a point of demarcation in which you move away from enhancing the flavor of whatever it is you're putting salsa on and just trying to defy God.
yeah.
And I
You
never
move from that to
understood.
masochism.
Yeah. I've never understood the whole thing. Like, if you have to wear gloves to eat the food that you're going to eat, something is wrong. And you probably shouldn't be putting that inside your body. That being said, though, I love the name for this.
It's hilarious. Does someone want to read the paragraph where this comes up?
Fine with me. I'm not sure we can even take another week here. The food, not a meat Olaf fancier, I gather. Can anything be done? Well, it's supposed to be for emergencies, but I guess this qualifies as one. Unlocking a black valise and gazing inside for a moment. Here you go. Handing over an ancient hand-blown bottle whose label, carefully engraved and printed in an unfaded spectrum of tropical colors, showed an erupting volcano, a parrot with a disdainful smile, and the legend, Cuidado cabron, salsa explosiva la original. Couple of drops is all you'll need, really, to light that beat Olaf right up. Not that I'm being stingy, understand. My father handed this on to me, as did his father to him, and it isn't down even a quarter of an inch yet, so do exercise caution is all I'm saying. It's set up so much like a 90s infomercial of like, man, I really wish I had something to help with this. Oh, really? Have you tried this? Just the ostentatious presentation of it all is so funny.
I also just love the implication that hot sauce is like Satan's asshole or like the devil's ringworm or what all of these things are like, called or whatever.
Yeah.
Are just sort of in just something that's existed in society forever.
Yeah.
And that this is one that's so ancient. This is the third owner it's had.
And you only need a small, like a drop to do the job.
Three people have owned it, and it's less than a quarter inch lighter than it was when it was presumably made. And I don't speak Spanish, but the Pinchon Wiki translates the name of it as "Watch Out, Fucker," the original explosive sauce, which is just a great title for one of these particular hot sauces.
Yeah.
I wanted to try to bridge the gap between the non-heat seekers of American life and those who are heat seekers, which is not like a term. I'm not one of the people who like chases the burn. I think
the
is
capsaicin high.
Yeah, but it genuinely just is a high. It is. There's a threshold where if you push past that in terms of the pain, it is literally identical to like being stoned or something.
Really?
Yeah. It's a inefficient way to get there.
I hate to interrupt you, but I do have to say real quick, this is making me think, if anybody hasn't watched this, please go do. When Conan O'Brien was on Hot Ones and completely lost his goddamn mind, is one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life. And you mentioning that this is kind of a high really makes that make a lot more sense. Understanding his reaction to everything. So I'm sorry, we'll go ahead.
I'm not a watcher of that program, but that episode was one that I watched, and it was worth it just to hear him explain. I don't remember what president it was, but the president who he implies committed suicide by eating bad lobster because the job was too hard. And I think that joke could only come from experiencing a drug high of some kind.
Yeah, no, it's like there. I look forward to about 20 years from now, though, some cultural anthropologist looking at the hot sauce market of the 2000s through 2010s. Just dissecting all the factors that led into it, because it is fascinating, and none of it was around when this book was set. Certainly not 3 generations beforehand.
Yeah,
And it's just it's wonderful.
it is. It's a great joke, and then he uses it to like get
Set up
into
next scene.
yeah, and like very like deep philosophical territory of like doubled realities and mirror places. Which is I mean it's a spoiler I guess for the end of the episode, but that has to be my most pinch on part of the chapter, is the idea that he would go from making this joke about a hot sauce that like is would be impossible to eat probably, to being something that did not exist, to Will's point, at the time of this book's actual like history minus 3 generations, to then making like a very insightful point about the bigger work he's doing in the novel. It's just very impressive that he's able to do stuff like that.
The hot sauce lets you see through time.
Yeah.
That's just weirdly, it's a really good depiction of the subjective experience of having too much capsaicin in your system. It is that sense of like time dilation that cannabis can do, and it is that sense of like doubling things and intrinsically like psychedelic kind of aspect of those kinds of substances. And it's just it's a fascinating thing, because I'm not sure if like there are moments in Pynchon's writing where it's clearly an intentional he is driving at depicting what it's like to be stoned, or driving at what it's like to be on whatever the one is called in Gravity's Rainbow, the fake one. But then there's just this where it seems like he's clearly thinking about having had too much hot sauce on food before. But I don't know, and it's hard to tell if it's intentionally supposed to hit that point, or if it's just coincidental.
Yeah, whether it's intentional or not, it's some genius, right? Before we move on to the actual like substantive is the word I'll cautiously use portion of the hot sauce joke. Does someone want to read the culmination of the joke, the small paragraph that starts with "as expected" on 130?
As expected, this advice was ignored, and next mealtime the bottle got passed around and everybody slopped on the salsa. The evening that resulted was notable for hysteria and recrimination.
Oh, it's so good. We then learn that in that state of hot sauce delirium, they are all able to use the first 2 words of the name of the salsa as a Tibetan mantra, essentially, that begins to dissolve the reality between like the cold hellscape they're currently in and a warmer, nicer climate that they would rather be in. And this gets to this idea of bridges between different worlds, the doubling of places being 2 places, or places being inherently connected in some way. That is important to this whole chapter, and I assume this whole section of the book, and as a whole, the book itself. So this is then where we are introduced to the discussion group aboard the boat that is filled with members of Candlebrow University. I wanted to open this one up to the group because this is another case where multiple contributors to the Pinch on Wiki are getting in a fight over what the name of this university means, if it does anything at all. I'm sure it has some kind of meaning. I don't think it's as serious as the people on the Pinch on Wiki are trying to make it, but I could be wrong. Do we have thoughts on the fact that it's called Candlebrow University, or do we just want to move on to the fact that one of them is named after a Hindu god?
I don't have anything other than like I found myself lost in this argument on the wiki.
Yeah,
and
dude,
constantly
it's
just
crazy.
reading through it like, why? What is the purpose of this? Why are we
I don't
bickering over
know.
this? And then we had to attach a whole bunch of dick pics, and
Yeah.
just, I don't. This is where I have a sort of gripe with But the literary analysis that goes on, especially in stuff like this, where people tend to have this idea that there can only be one interpretation and that everything is objective and there is no subjectivity in art. And so this is where this bickering comes from, is exactly that. It's people like, my way has to be right, because if it's not, then it invalidates everything else I believe about it. But the fact of the matter is, it means what it means to you, and it doesn't always have to have a specific individual meaning. So all of these are technically right and they're all technically wrong, but they're also just annoying. I didn't come to the Pinchon Wiki to see people argue over whether Candlebrow U was a dick reference or if it was just a reference to Lovecraft. Like it's maddening.
Yeah, and it's also, an outgrowth of this idea that like Pinchon is 4D chessing everything, which he is, but to such a degree that like every single name and every single title has like this deep, intrinsic meaning, which like a lot of it does. I don't want to invalidate the fact that people like want to research that stuff. But I do think that there is an inherent comedy to a couple pages ago, someone on the Pinchon Wiki saying, I really embarrassed myself by assuming that this name meant something more by asking a Norwegian person if they had a dish called Meat Olaf, to then the fight that takes place over the name of this university in the contributions to that page note. So I'm I'm with you on a lot of what you.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, my own personal interpretation lines up more with the yogic interpretation, as well as the pun that's listed in the same paragraph on the Pynchon Wiki. The things being higher lowbrow or whatever, and candlebrow being an interesting play on that. But also just the idea that like a lot of the time, and this is one that is not listed on the Pynchon Wiki for some, like this one feels so obvious to me, and maybe I'm crazy, but like if you're a scholar, like it's been a stereotype of scholars since the beginning of scholarship that they don't quite keep themselves to high society standards of dress and grooming, and so like they've got a greasy forehead that makes it shine. So it's like
that.
There's the double pun in that single thing of like the forehead is so greasy that you have the reflection of the light, but also just the idea you have so much face oil on your forehead that you could make a candle out of it. And I just don't understand how any of this stuff on the Pynchon Wiki, other than the chakra stuff, is more obvious to people. And it's a great instance of, not everyone thinks alike.
Now you need to go post that on there so 5 people can tell you that you're wrong and why.
They tell you it's all about penises for some reason. That person, they need to talk to somebody.
Okay, that person is like, and this is the thing that's irritating about this book on Pynchon Wiki in particular, is that there's at least one person who keeps making references to things that happen like 800 pages later.
That's true. Yeah.
Because like what they're saying is not incredibly baseless. It's also not relevant to this chapter at all.
Yeah.
It's crazy. So from there, with Dr. Vormans and his sort of normal domain of the university, we are also told that another person on the boat is noted quaternianist Dr. V. Ganesh Rao of Calcutta University. That is a name directly of a Hindu god. He is the Hindu god of obstacles. He sometimes removes obstacles for people. More commonly, he places obstacles in front of people who need to be humbled or need a sort of obstacle to get over. He is also, though, Lord of Letters and Learning, which is probably where a lot more of that comes from. This guy. And then we also have a couple of other people. The American bucket shop desperado, Dodge Flannelette, that's just a mouthful of a last name. And then we additionally have Mr. Fleetwood Vibe here at the behest of his father. Do we have any thoughts on the members of this society and their names? I know, Will, you usually have some good information with anything that sort of overcrosses into Eastern traditions as far as Hinduism or Buddhism.
Okay, so when it comes to the name V. Ganesh Rao, I want to make clear that could just be someone's name. That's like a relatively normal name.
Oh, really? Okay.
Like, I mean, I think naming your child Ganesh would be odd, but in the way that like naming your child, I think it would be seen as you're stuck up. But I don't know enough about Hindu culture, and it's a big enough subcontinent that I'm sure opinions would vary. But it is like a normal name. There's also just this is something that just because I don't want it to come across as necessarily an official endorsement of the Mapping the Zone podcast, but V. Ganesh Rao sounds a lot like the name of a blogger, Venkatesh Rao, who used to run the blog Ribbon Farm, and is, if you ask me, one of the only decent thinkers to come out of that whole Bay Area rationalist cult kind of thing. For y'all in this call, if you have like an insane amount of free time and you just want to read like some good, interesting nonfiction essays about just like stuff that is inventive in terms of use of language, I highly recommend Venkatesh Rao's stuff. But also Venkatesh Rao he was a cricketer who was very relevant in the 70s and 80s, and I would not be surprised at all if Pynchon didn't like sports, obviously, at least not a lot, but did get into cricket. That just feels like his kind of thing.
Yeah, I could see it.
Yeah.
I don't have any other thoughts on the names here, except that Dodge Flannelette.
What a name.
They're, what's the name for the shop rags? That's what it is. It's a shop rag. His name is
Dodge Shop Rag.
His name is Shop Rag, Dodge Flannelette.
Yeah.
He's working on cars. He's cleaning them.
And bucket shop, for those wanting to know what the slang means, it's a business designed to cheat people. So, Dodge Flannelette is a shop rag who is cheating people, which means that this person may be a dishonest mechanic. Who knows?
So Facebook Marketplace before the internet.
Chamois, that's the word I was looking for.
Yes, chamois.
This is where we get a sort of random reference to Scarsdale Vibe with his son. He gives a mention to the idea that, like, while he has sent his son on this expedition, he doesn't really trust his son with business information. He'll tell him some stuff, but won't be super forthcoming with him. There is a reference here to Brother Harriman is out buying up scientists by the shipload, mobilizing some kind of Alaskan junk. Him and old Schiff as usual, hand in glove, almost certainly suggesting a scheme for a rail link across the Bering Strait, Alaska to Siberia, hooking on into the Trans-Sib, and from there, God only knows. This is the reference to a real guy and a real thing that happened. Harriman is a reference to a railroad tycoon from the period who, like Scarsdale mentions him, he was viewed as a climber at first because how he made his fortune is he would invest in failing railroads, sort of turn them around to be profitable and a bit more successful, and then he built off of the back of that to purchase other railway companies and sort of expand personal wealth. Even stranger, Harriman had a bust made by Rodin. There's a photo of it on his Wikipedia page. But it's crazy to me that it's just one of those moments where, like, different aspects of history overlap with each other in ways that make you realize that they were contemporaries. but it's also just strange that Rodan did a bust of a railroad tycoon. At the height of Harriman's powers, he actually owned the Union Pacific Railway, the Southern Pacific Railway, Wells Fargo, the whole company, and then several other smaller regional railways, especially in the Midwest and Illinois. Harriman's financial partner was the Schiff that is referenced by Scarsdale Vibe. Schiff not only was Jewish, as Vibe derogatorily mentions, but he was actually very, very active in the Jewish community in Chicago and in the Midwest in particular. So it wasn't just sort of an incidental fact about him. He was very involved in like Jewish affairs and the Jewish world. Harriman never built a railway between Alaska and Siberia. In case you didn't know, there is no bridge connecting those two areas of the world. He just was really into Alaska and like really wanted to hunt bear in particular for some reason. And so he contracted a boat, and he did fill it with a bunch of scientists to go up to Alaska. John Muir was actually on that boat of the John Muir Trail and John Muir Woods in America, and they published a book of the different like species of birds or plant life that they found, potentially discovered in a lot of cases. It was just literally a scientific expedition because Harriman was like really into Alaska and also really wanted to hunt a bear, but never managed to successfully do that. In fact, like his interest in Alaska didn't match that of the scientists because the scientists were all having a time, and then at a certain point, Harriman was like, "This is taking too long. I need to get back to my businesses." And they turned around before sort of fully elucidating everything they were trying to do, so that he could get back to running his business. But the rumor about him wanting to build a railroad between Siberia and Alaska is true. that was something that people at the time thought that maybe he was doing, because it was incredibly strange that a railway tycoon was just buying up a bunch of scientists for a few months to go north for some reason. Like, people didn't believe that there wasn't a business related thing that he was doing. So just like a fun random fact from American history about. Any other thoughts on this section before we get into the actual transnoctial discussion?
More a note on the podcast. I think this might be the most times that E.H. Harriman's name has been said in a work of to big us up art that is not about him since Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid.
Fair, yeah. He was a major villain in that and the Wild Bunch.
Yeah.
There's also a stand-in for him in Red Dead Redemption 2, according to his Wikipedia page.
Really?
God.
Yeah. He's like one of those guys where you don't know anything about him, and then you like look them up for some reason, and then it turns out that they're all over history at that time in America.
Uh-huh.
Like, why did Rodan do a bust of him? That I don't know what it is about that fact in particular that just like sticks out in my head. Also, it's kind of a bad bust. Like it looks like a low poly rendering of a clay head.
Yeah, it does. I'm looking at it right now. It's like it's 3D printed when 3D printers just started.
Like Rodan has done better, for lack of a better term.
It looks like he was trying to do Wilford Brimley, and then someone was like, "No, it needs to be Edward Harriman." Oh,
like, so I hadn't pulled up the bust until you started describing it, and I'm sitting here thinking, okay, yeah, I know that's but it's Auguste Rodin. That's what he does. No, if y'all are listening to this, it's a weird ass bust.
Yeah, it's really strange. The way Cody described it is pretty accurate. It looks 3D printed, but like from a poor render.
I feel like I'm playing Half-Life 2.
I'm gonna say,
yeah.
It's like someone took a PS2 game and 3D printed a character.
I also just want to know where that is. Like, is that in a museum somewhere? Can you go look at that?
Oh, that's a good question.
Does it look that uncanny in person?
I'm curious how big it is too.
Also a good question. The only Rodin I've seen is really tiny. There's one at the art museum at the university that I live near, but it's very small.
So, according to Wikipedia, as of over 10 years ago now, it was at the Palace of the Legion in San Francisco.
Mm.
Who knows where
I
it is
actually might
today?
be in San Francisco in May, so I might pop over and take a look.
Dude, do it. Let us know if it looks crazy in person.
Yeah. I'll get pictures if I go, for sure.
So this leads us to the transnoctial discussion group, which I'm sorry I keep bringing it up, but I don't know why people keep fighting in the Pinch on Wiki for this chapter.
Or posting entire pages of the D&D handbook.
Okay, what is that about? What
don't know.
like I'm
I genuinely
like-
don't know.
I was so confused why that was there. Like and then I thought to myself, okay, was it just that this person could only find a definition for this word for some reason from that? Nope, it's just an actual D&D thing that you're thinking is relevant to this line in Pinshot. It was so strange. He includes like the damage,
It's
the
the
damage
whole
rolls.
thing is- yeah.
It's the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really weird because I can see like value of maybe taking those first two paragraphs because there is like a poetic
Sure.
sibilance.
Yeah.
But you don't need its abilities and stat block. I don't need to know what its charisma modifier is.
Ooze traits. Noctials are immune to all mind-affecting effects. Poison, sleep effect, paralysis, polymorph, stunning, critical hits, flanking, and all effects relying on sight.
Well,
Like they just
Ugh.
hit Control A before they hit Control C.
Yeah.
no, okay. Here's my best go at why they put it in here. They think that it's a Thanatoid, and they think that it just so
Mm.
happens that D&D perfectly lines up with the properties of Thanatoia. I don't know. I'm stretching.
It's crazy. It's crazy. This should be to any listeners. This should be a moment to learn that having multiple sources is a good idea, because while the Pinch on Wiki is really great for something like Bleeding Edge, where it seems like one person wrote the entirety of it, this is an example where the fact that it is a wiki comes fully enforced to the person reading it.
Yeah.
And comparing and contrasting reading on the wiki with other sources it is a very, very good idea.
There at least needs to be a moderator on here or something that can really
Something,
thin down
yeah.
some of this stuff.
Well,
I had assumed there was until we started covering this book, if I'm being honest.
it just comes like Against the Day is just if anyone wants to rewind back to the beginning of our coverage of this book and remember my utter lack of words to describe what I thought about this book, I think this is the inversion of that. This is people who don't want to accept that they don't have the words to describe what they're trying to get at.
Yeah, that's fair.
All throwing their ideas on the paper, and none of them having enough confidence in their own interpretation of things to say, no, this doesn't help anything.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if I just throw it up there, someone will find it useful.
Well, like I said, put the top two paragraphs of Dungeons and Dragons forum, copy paste. That's insightful. Don't know. Unless your idea is that Thomas Pynchon is explicitly mentioning this specific monster manual entry. I just
Mhm.
I'm not going to sit here and say I can't see Pinchon playing D&D. I would
I'm sure he's
love
done
for
it
him
at
to
least
run a game.
once.
That'd be amazing. But I don't think he's going and checking sources in the monster manual for what might have been 35 at this time. Maybe even advanced D&D, depending on when. I don't know, because the link to this thing is busted. So
This is a discussion group that takes place in a lounge in the basement of the hotel, and it is quote located well out of the earshot of guests who might have wished, for example, to sleep. So apparently they get pretty heated. The topic for this particular evening is the nature of expedition. And where this sort of starts is with a callback to the beginning of the chapter, in the sense that they are beginning to colonize and explore sort of sky and this sort of lattice work realm, as Pynchon would describe it in the opening paragraphs of this sort of what was previously thought to be ether that is now understood to not be. And then there's some references to of like, oh, when we're up there, we're really going to be like chasing God, which is a very real interpretation of what the sky was for a very, very long time. That was just where God was, and they're obviously speaking. You could interpret it as literally, but I think it's more of a metaphor. And once we're up there, we've basically claimed all of the territory that used to be God's. So maybe we ourselves are God now. And then beyond that, they start immediately talking about like other places that they can colonize and that they can control and hopefully commodify. And one of the ones that they're talking about is time. And this leads to a discussion that involves a lot of mathematical formulas and thoughts from the time period. I am not a mathematician. I'm terrible at math, so I'm going to leave this to Will to explain, or
Okay.
anyone else who may have a better understanding of the specific math that they're getting at here. But Pynchon is helpful in that he summarizes it at the end by saying that time is circular. But before he gets to that point, he does a lot of these equations. So like Will, Luke, Cody, if you know more about what's going on here than I do, I'd love to hear your explanation of it.
I tried to follow through this on the wiki, and I ended up just like realizing I was just staring at the screen for a little while. I was like, okay, none of this makes sense.
So we've got math, right? And math is trying to do something pretty specific. Math is trying to be useful. It's trying to take logic and be applicable. Take logic, take the idea of true or false or discrete values or whatever, and map it onto the chaos that is our world. And people pretty quickly, as in probably over 5,000 years ago, realized, wait a second, no, just because we can count things doesn't mean that that math is like the math that we use is coherent to reality. And so one of these ideas was you have this concept of adding, and that's how you get natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and on. And then they realized, wait a second, what if you take things away? What do we call that? And we name that subtraction, and we model that as the inverse, the opposing action of the action of addition, of going from 1 to 2. The opposing action is subtraction. And yeah, I'm just gonna skip ahead there for a while. That doesn't really make sense geometrically. You can't have more or less of a real space. What this boils down to is that at a certain point of using math to model reality and using it to prove or disprove ideas, you have to come to terms with the idea that you can't take a square root of a negative number. Because sure, negative numbers are useful, and when you're talking about things that are being modeled in in not just purely positive terms, you do really need to, especially when you're just calculating things, you need to deal with negative numbers. And so the best way to think about it, I guess, is that imaginary numbers, the simple way it's described is that an imaginary number is the symbol that means the square root of -1. Now, technically, it's defined differently, but I think the useful way to think about it in terms of this conversation is that on a number line, you have 0 in the middle, you have +1 up through infinity on the right, and you have -1 through -infinity on the left. And the idea of taking a square root is the idea of finding the inversion of the, I guess it would be called the first order exponent, and taking something multiplied by itself and finding a systematic way of doing so for any number. And if you do that with negative numbers, it doesn't work. And so you just call that I and leave it there. But the actual like mathematical theory behind that is best thought of as when you are trying to take a square root of a number on the number line, you start to see the geometrical, the kind of intuitive geometry that's happening here. And because we're talking about square roots, really best to think about it as a two-dimensional Cartesian axis. And that's this. I was trying to avoid it because they're talking about complex numbers, and that's mapped on a different axis. But basically,
I wish I could help you so much, dude. I'm so sorry.
basically, when you're talking of, if you now have this two-dimensional plane, the Cartesian coordinate graph, and that's made of two number lines that go from -infinity to +infinity, centered on 0 and intersecting on 0. If you're talking about squaring something, the function of that is going to be mapped on this Cartesian plane as in numerical form, x squared equals y. And so you can draw a line that traces the infinitely small gradations in that going to the upper right, and that is but almost at least every American, and I'm sure everyone who attended any kind of formal schooling learned about as quadratic equations. And you once you start trying to conceptualize the idea of doing the inverse of that square on the opposite side of the scale, what you quickly realize is that it just doesn't function. You cannot have this generalized idea because the square root, or because the process of exponentiation is so intrinsically spatial in terms of how it's always used. Like we use math in that way, I guess. And I'm sure some actual mathematician is going to be tearing their hair out while I try to describe this in plain language. But please be easy on me, or provide something that we can include in the next podcast. But basically, what you have to do in order to create this generalized approach to doing negative roots is go back to that single dimensional number line and think about what the difference is between +1 and -1. And the only difference is the orientation with respect to that 0 in the middle. And that goes for the difference between any value on either side, and that's the entire idea of the absolute value. So if you choose to then model that relationship in a way that I don't think could be coherently like graphed, but if you can, you mentally model the orientational difference of those things, what you have is 180 degrees. So I is that which, when squared, is equivalent to going 180 degrees away from whatever the actual unit you're discussing is. And that means that it must be essentially that intersection of the y coordinate on the one-dimensional number line. So I represents a 50%, a 1/2. Is it 1/2? Oh God, where's my radians? Why is my brain not working? That 90-degree shift is what the figure of I is depicting and is summarizing. I is a unit that defines that spatial relationship between the positive and the negatives in terms which can be handled with arithmetic. So that gets you to the start of this conversation. Dr. Rao's stuff about mapping of linear axis becoming curvilinear, I am not entirely sure I can put in any simpler language. I think Pynchon has done maybe the best that's possible. But what needs to be considered is that when you're talking about graphing complex numbers, it's a little bit of that is getting into why it's called why it's called the imaginary number. Because when you're talking about the complex plane, you're talking about something that is not real. You're talking about the degrees of that 90-degree spatial factor that you are integrating into the real factor of whatever your numbers are representing. And a lot of the time that is going to be graphed as a polar coordinate system where so like a complex number is a plus bi. Is the format for a complex number, and you're going to graph a as the real component, as in the component that you can easily extricate from that turning in a real space, and you leave the remainder of what you can't extricate, that imaginary component, that the thing that is operating oppositionally with regard to the main thread of modeling, is going to be plotted as very often is going to be plotted as an angle, essentially. Once you try to integrate those things together, once you try to integrate the real graphing, like the real spatial graphing of a Cartesian plane or even a three-dimensional linear space with this idea of these imaginary numbers that do have fundamentally real representations, we just don't spatially conceive of them. Like, for example, the wavelength, the amplitude of current going through a wire, where there is something happening that is not quite spatial, and so we just kind of repurpose I to represent that as well. Once you're trying to compromise those two concepts of space, you get quaternions, which we've spoken a lot about, and I just don't feel like trying to explain again.
Yeah, but we covered it in a previous episode.
Yeah.
In essence, it helps you map 3D space is the easiest sort of recoverage of that I can think of to put into words.
Yeah, that it's taking the I, and instead of making the I representing the radial component of the real space as the term was derived, what you do is you map real space onto the imaginary plane, but in order to do that, you have to split it into three-dimensional components, I, J, and K. And so that sucks to deal with mathematically, and so vectors are just dropping the entire conceit of actually modeling a real space. Vectors are more or less equivalent to the idea of a matrix or an array. It is just an n-dimensional quantity of numbers. It is a set of, not mathematical set. It is numbers arranged around one another. If you take the approach that Dr. Rao in this book does, you have essentially you have to concede the idea that time is meaningfully circular, and the vectorists, because they are not trying to reify time as a concept intrinsically in the way they are doing their arithmetic to model reality, can continue to act as though there is no real correlation between these figures and whatever they're modeling. Does that make sense?
It is certainly the most digestible version that I was able to dig up of the stuff that is talked about there. Of course, like you kind of wrapped it up with, Pynchon also wraps it up with by mentioning this idea that time is circular, or that it creates this sort of eternal return, which is of course a reference to real philosophical stuff from history, but I think also has a broader implication on Pynchon's work as a whole. His idea that he looks at eras of American and world history as cycles, and writes at these sort of pivotal moments of change, and how a lot of this stuff kind of happens again and again and again. Nothing is really new. It's just sort of repurposed or differently named from the last cycle, or so to speak. I'm sure that a lot of that probably comes more to play as the book goes on, but it's interesting to see him apply this sort of mathematical quotient to it, and also just gets to the idea that like his intellect is at a level that is staggering, the way that he puts this stuff together and then relates it all to literary purposes. Thank you, Will. I can't imagine trying to put all that together myself and describe
for real.
It. Yeah.
Don't thank me yet. I'm not a mathematician. I'm like I'm not qualified to be trying to explain any of these things. So please, anyone who is enchanted by these ideas, go read some actual mathematics or go listen to like lectures from actual mathematicians or professors. Because I'm not doing a very good job of explaining it.
Certainly better than I could. That's for damn sure. From there, they get into references to luminiferous aether again. There has now come a sort of a new degree of scientific thought trying to disprove it through other questions, specifically this idea of Fitzgerald's view of velocity and a shrinkage of the dimension in the same direction. This is references to real mathematics and scientific development. The stuff that he is talking about in these quotes would later come into play once Einstein put together the like field theory and things like that much later. And then we get we sort of get a random reference from the potentially extra man. We have the quote here: "Berries under mushrooms from a heckler somewhere in the room whom nobody strangely seemed quite able to locate." And we get into this idea further of these different realms, different worlds, and how some of it may exist outside of time. And give me some rope here, in the same way that imaginary numbers and that side of mathematics sort of exists out of what we understood at the time to be how to map reality to numbers, creating these two different worlds, so to speak. Then we get a correction that it's not necessarily outside of time, but in a different relation to time, the stuff that they're talking about. And then they're saying that perhaps how you see through that sort of filter, so to speak, to this other world is through the very sort of calcite which, according to rumor, you people are up here seeking, quote unquote. And this is where we get brought up once again, Iceland Spar. And the librarian of the Library of Iceland, which, sort of backtracking a little bit, someone who's there for this discussion is a librarian from the Library of Iceland. And there's a book on the shelf called the Book of Iceland Spar that is commonly described as, quote, like the, I'm not going to mispronounce it, but the thing that they are referencing is a real book. It is one of the sagas of Norse kings. And it is like that book, only different, containing family histories going back to the first discovery and exploitation of the eponic mineral up to the present, including a record of each day of this very expedition now in progress, even if days yet transpired. So that's how they move into this idea of like, oh, maybe this calcite, optical calcite, has a effect on time, or has an effect on the world as we understand.
Basically, what I want to jump in to say is that I kind of get the sense that that little exchange there is kind of Pynchon's theory of what a great work of art is something which is refracted through various lenses of whoever's reading it, but holds something that at least feels transcendently true throughout the ages. And I think that's just an interesting just an interesting kind of implication that he's just throwing out there like it's an offhand joke, which is maybe the way we should talk about what quality in art is.
That's good. I did not pick up on. Was there any detail you wanted to give beyond that kind of overview? Admittedly, it's not something I thought about because I didn't.
It's not so much a thing to dig into as it is, I when I read that where they're talking about, it seems like an important property to be missing. Treating time is the same way as God, soul, fairies under mushrooms, something that isn't real. And then segueing into talking about libraries, talking about models of rationalism, talking about the difference between British and Icelanders in their approach to animism, and the ways that if certain texts are truly are in a meaningful sense true, then it must mean that they are something which is in a different relation to time, at least in this metaphorical sense.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I could nail down an exact line of reasoning.
I see. I feel like I'm seeing what you're pointing to. I don't know if I can add anything. Yeah, I'm gonna have to think. I'm gonna have to think about that, and then also too, I'm gonna have to see if there's anything else that comes up in the same kind of circle. The librarian, though, brings up after that kind of interlude that they'll find Iceland spar everywhere in the world, often in the neighborhood of zinc or silver, some of it in perfectly good use for optical instruments. But up here, of the essence, found in no other company but its own. The genuine article in the substructure of reality, the doubling of the creation, each image clear and believable. And you, being mathematical gentlemen, it can hardly have escaped your attention that its curious advent into the world occurred with only a few years of the discovery of imaginary numbers, which also provided a doubling of the mathematical creation. And this kind of gets into, I think I have the next 28 lines highlighted.
As you should.
As far as like what it is that he's getting at here, and what he's describing to these mathematicians. He talks about how coming up to Iceland, again, not the literal country, but the land of ice, is them crossing over to a different world, this more kind of magical world, this sort of thematic world that he's talked about as being the interior, and also this hidden realm. And then I wrote out a whole flurry of notes response to the next page and a half, which I guess I'll just kind of speak on, and then you can tell me if I'm crazy. But to me, like this is a chapter that has a lot of layers that all kind of come to roost, so to speak, in this one portion where the librarian is speaking, and some of which actually overlap with other aspects of Pynchon's writing. Obviously, he talks about the Arctic and Bleeding Edge, but also there's the whole sort of intrusion, so to speak, of the Hollow Earther in Mason and Dixon and everything to do with that, and all of the stuff we've talked about for the better part of a year now, with Pynchon's understanding of kind of creation, what happens when you discover new places, and how all of this stuff builds together. And the Hollow Earth, as sort of understood, is the realm of inherent magic, holiness, or majesty that's slowly eroded by the arrival of modernity and sort of the pushing forward of market forces and capitalism and all of the trappings that come along with it. The ability for humans to access this world shrinks, as we've talked about before, as the world moves further into history, but it doesn't disappear. To me, these lines make it clear that the magic inherent to that world and that world as a whole has sort of merged further into the earth and is stored within the Iceland Spar now that it's been discovered, and can be used as that lens to still gain access to that world, even as our ability to physically walk into it shrink. What I find interesting, though, is the usage of quotes around real in the text. As I mentioned earlier, there's a line specifically that the librarian says, Iceland Spar is what hides the hidden people, makes it possible for them to move through the world that thinks of itself as real, quote unquote. To me, this could indicate the fact that it is capitalism and modernity that push us forward, but these things are not real in the sense that the Hollow Earth is real, and the things that represent. No more real than the information is that the wealthy class are trying to commoditize at the very beginning of the chapter as sort of a new method of making money. It's all fake, and it really only exists because enough people agree to its principles in order to be driven forward into society and to sort of further the American project, get to this further idea that Pynchon talks about a lot. So you contrast that with the realm of spirituality and magic, where the stuff of real substance directs people, like the guiding stones mentioned in the beginning of the chapter. And you can see how Pynchon is making the case that it's actually the interior hidden realm that is not the exterior, sort of quote unquote real. Combine this with the usage of Iceland Spar specifically, and the way that it refracts light to double an image, and you see that there are two worlds that we can choose to live in. One, there's the inner world, one that is full of guidance, imagination, magic, the inherent majesty of creation. Two, the outer world of science, modernity, and capital. And then this chapter as a whole has to deal with someone choosing to go from one world to the other, and then a group of people from that outer world coming into the try and plunder it, what it's worth. Each of us chooses one of these worlds, but the latter option is the only quote unquote real world to the top 1%, because they're the only one who benefits from it. To choose the inner world is to choose one where meaning comes from the world itself and your place in its creation, not from what is forced onto you and the framework in which you live in and work in. Given that Iceland Spar is likely the sunstone used by Vikings for navigational purposes, it makes sense that Pynchon would use it thematically as the source of guidance to locate the hidden world by illuminating this fact, and that there is another option available to you beyond the trappings of capitalism. So that's sort of my whole philosophical or literary framework that I pulled out of the chapter. If I am correct in my thought process, it's really cool stuff that Pynchon is doing in this book, and the way that he's going about doing it, I find incredibly compelling and engrossing, and in a way that, much like Infinite Jest, another giant book, makes me want to recommend this book to people, but also with the knowledge that it is a very hard recommend. because
Yeah.
of how long it is. And again, like I've already said in the episode, how sort of short we are into the book, or how little of the book we've read, and how much ground has been covered just to get really this whole like monologue by the librarian through to the end of the chapter was just sort of like a mind-blowing revelation to me.
Mhm. No, I'm 100% with you on that. I think you put it perfectly, and it's without I don't obviously I'm trying to keep everything I say in context of where we are in the book and not get ahead of things and um, push for ideas that will be expounded on later or be discussed later or fleshed out later. But I do again to go back to the first time I read this was I think the point in the book where I was completely sold on everything that it was throwing at me. And it's as you mentioned, it's incredibly frustrating to have this as a favorite book because almost no one wants to read it. When I tell people, if someone asks like what's your favorite book, and I'll tell them, if I had to pick one, it'd probably be Against the Day. What is it about? Everything. I, I don't like where do you want me to start with this? It's a 1,000-page book that talks about the duality of the world that exists and how our course is somewhat predetermined but isn't, but at the same time we could change the world in such a way that we could remap it to what it should be and strip away the damage that capitalism has caused to it. But at the same time, we have to understand that there is no way to go back, that we're locked into this position and have no real control over it anymore because the people who have the money have the power and they're the ones that control and dictate where everything goes. So it becomes this long-winded thing. And but it's so brilliantly done. And the librarian's speech really, like you said, is a very good distillation of pretty much all of this and how perfectly he is able to put this on the page and summarize it in this way is mind blowing as well. I just can't. Yeah, it's hard for me to formulate a decent thought and extrapolate it verbally, but it's part of what makes this and the next chapter maybe my favorites in the book.
I ordered a piece of Iceland Spar after the chapter.
Like Cody, I'm having trouble myself discerning the thoughts that are coming from this chapter and those that are coming from the book as a whole. What I'll say with regards to your thoughts, Kate, is that I think that in terms of the conversation happening here on the page, that's all very good. That makes a lot of sense. It lines up with what I think as well. What I would also add, though, is that Pynchon is not only interested in the imaginary number, complex numbers. He's interested in the divide between quaternions and vectors. And so it's not so much the 90 degrees that are the 90 degrees of light that are obscuring the entryway into the caves of the interior of the planet. I think that in that particular paragraph, real is quoted for the sake of highlighting the pun between the discussion of complex numbers and the idea of reality. But also, I think that it might be a somewhat limiting framework to divide it into a simple binary of interior and exterior.
Sure.
As we go through the whole of the book.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think where I'm at mentally in my understanding, not just of numbers, but also how to most easily straighten it out in my own head, is pointing towards that.
No, yeah, absolutely. I just
Yeah.
I just don't want to get ahead of
Yeah, no, of course.
us, and I also I'm trying to communicate something that is at 90 degrees from what you're saying.
Sure, yeah.
I think you're right. But you're also don't lock yourself in. That's all.
Sure. I'm right, but I'm not all the way there.
No, I don't. I mean, I don't think I'm I don't think my understanding of this book is anywhere near complete, so I'm not saying that either.
Right, yeah. Well, I mean, probably the only person whose understanding it was complete is Binchon's.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yep.
Which, like, as this book develops, I feel like the saddest thing for me as a fan of the work, I'll never be able to just hear him talk about it. I feel like it'd be
Mhm.
fascinating just to hear him like speak on this book and sort of his understanding of it and his construction of it. Like, yeah, it's already sad enough that we don't really get much from, but not having additional detail from him on this particular novel in his bibliography, that's going to be a hard one to swallow if this book remains at the level of quality it has been so far. So from there, we kind of return back a layer in the framework to the characters that this is all evidently centered around, mainly Hunter, though. We get some beautiful descriptions of ice and the land. And Hunter returns home after sketching all of these sort of new exciting things, and he says that he wants this to be a bon voyage party, but that there's nothing to eat. So he's going to head over to Narvik's for some food. His grandmother warns him that there's bad ice after midnight, but that he thinks he can get out there and come back quick enough. And this is where, like I kind of had mentioned, I think Pynchon knows when he's making his readers work, and so he decides to give them a reprieve afterwards.
Mhm.
And his reprieve here comes from the description of this diner, which is hilarious. There is one particular line in here. The only eating place open this time of night was Narvik's mushied away northern cuisine, crowded at all hours, usually with a queue out the door. Hunter foresaw a long wait. Not only was the line intolerably slow, often it did not move for 15 minutes, but when it did move, it ratcheted ahead only a fraction of the space of a single body would occupy, as if some of those waiting were somehow only fractionally present. I, as I have said many times, work in a cafe, and the cafe that I work in is surrounded by glass. It's in an old Art Deco building, which is really cool. And so there's windows on the entire exterior. And there is a restaurant in the city I live in that is very popular on the weekends for like brunch and kind of let's go out to this place activities, where I will watch a line of people form at the door of this restaurant all the way up to the end of the block
Jesus.
and just remain stagnant for like hours, and just someone I'll pick a guy to focus on as I'm like making drinks or making food and interacting with people, and just see how long it takes that person to move from where I first saw him to the door. And I've never been in this restaurant. My fiance tells me their food is okay, but that it is like
It's always
one
the case. It's always
yeah. That it is like maybe one step above like the food that we make in the cafe that I work in. It has become a real source of amusement because apparently how this restaurant works is very similar to Narvik's in that you wait in line, you get in, you order, they give it to you, and there's like not really anywhere for you to sit and eat it. Like there might be a couple of like bar stools or like a couple tables, but by and large you just kind of have to leave with the food. Like and you've waited in line for God knows how long to get it. But that isn't the only joke. There's like a robot conveyor belt that runs along the line that has not just like the names of the dishes on the menu, but also the thing that it made me think of was like sushi boats at those all you can eat places.
Yeah.
Where it like floats on by you, and apparently people like like rob the robot of its display food to eat instead of waiting. They their specials are all very funnily named, and they always have meat olaf. So that ties into something that was mentioned again at the beginning of this chapter, kind of all pull together. And then we learn about the chef himself, who apparently just never sleeps. He's just constantly making food in the kitchen, and then he tries with Arctic humor to cheer up the people in line, which just is puns. It's just puns.
3 bad jokes.
Just 3 bad dad jokes in a row that he gives to the patron. It's great. It's just a bit of really, really good fun after some really dense reading.
Mm-hmm.
And Hunter gets a couple of those meat Olafs, and he wants the mystery sauce on the side. I can't imagine what that is. And then as he's heading back home to his grandmother, we get this reference to this area being the Venice of the Arctic, versus the secular Venice. And this is a case where like the word secular has come up a lot so far in this book. And as we've mentioned a couple times this episode, there's been about it in the Pinch on Wiki. But that clearly what they're trying to say is that like the word secular implies sort of the day, or like of the modern world, you know, of sort of that quote unquote real world. And this is another case of doubling taking place. That this place is doubled to the Venice of the quote unquote real world. And then he goes on to sort of make a couple of different comparisons between this place and the real life Venice, and how those things are mirrored. So continuing once again to sort of build on these ideas that are present through the entirety of the chapter. Does anyone have any thoughts on that, or what Hunter's grandmother talks about in relation to ice potentially being like a living creature?
This is something that has been hinted at throughout this chapter. And
True.
definitely,
like there's a line about the ice giving an argument in
I
the
tie this
discussion group.
I tie this to the extra man, and I have this. I'm kind of playing with this idea of the extra man really just being the sort of personification of the earth that we've talked about before. We also talked about it in Mason and Dixon, but I think there have been these subtle hints of not, if not necessarily the earth itself, then the sort of guardians that are set to protect it that would exist in like mythology and stuff. This is where I also get into, I've been replaying the Final Fantasy VII remake series, and so my brain goes to that too, because they have a lot of that deals with these environmental things and the impact of draining the earth of its resources for capitalistic concerns. In the game, there are these giant protectors of the planet that are sent out whenever the planet is in distress, and they are put there in order to guard the planet. And when something happens, they go and they find whatever it is that's causing the problem, and they try to eliminate it. So my brain in reading this has been like super fixated on this idea of this extra man is really the ominous earth protector that's sort of making its presence known and letting these people know that it's there, whether it's through the ice creaking or it's obvious something doesn't want us to know. The story with his grandma earlier on, and again in chapter 12, when they talk about the singing voices that they heard in the sky. These things all happen right before these sort of moments of there's this implication of a larger organism or something that's there that's trying to make itself known. And again, this is the main focus of the next chapter, so I don't want to get too far into it. But I think that's where all these things are pointing at, is to foreshadow what is about to happen.
My thought is also more to do with the ice being a living creature kind of thing. Basically, just the idea of things that are not alive suggesting ice and being thrown out of class. And she went to Catholic school. Nuns were throwing her out of class. I don't know. I just like the kind of implicit dichotomy that I haven't heard it articulated anywhere other than Pynchon. It doesn't strike me as a surprisingly novel idea, though. So may well have not been his concept, but just the idea that Christian Science allows for, like, historically speaking, the history of science, there was a period of time where life included fire in the Catholically approved texts and stuff. And I think the idea of ice being, despite all of its formal similarities to fire, in that it's it is self-propagating. It requires conditions, but it is self-propagating, and it grows and it shrinks and yada yada. That just to say ice in would get you thrown out of class, I think, is an interesting kind of comment on Pynchon's view of Christianity, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Certainly from the degree of shutting down mysticism to tie it into some of the stuff with Harold. And to speak on, just to slowly loop back to what you mentioned, Cody, there is that idea within Norse mythology of like spirits of the land specifically.
Mm-hmm. I think it's in Japanese. I'm sure it's in a lot of mythologies.
Yeah, it within that specific Nordic mythology, though, if you're practicing heathen, you're actually meant to like sacrifice to the spirits of the land and pay them veneration before you do anything else. Like if you're doing a ritual for one of the gods and it's outside, you're meant to also give a sacrifice to the land. They come in all sorts of different like shapes and forms. Land Veteater is typically how I've seen them referred to. So that is an idea that has roots within the world that this chapter is operating in. So if we don't have anything else from there, we have the final page break of this chapter, which is where the next morning, Constance wakes up and searches for her grandson. Only finds a goodbye note. And so she goes outside and sees that sort of a melancholy has settled over the whole sort of town, that her grandson is gone, and can't bring herself to look at his goodbye note again, for fear that if she opens up the paper itself will be blank, which I think is just a perfect encapsulation of the stuff from these last couple pages of the chapter, from this idea that like he has been seduced to go into the other world, to speak of the sort of binary God. And as a result of that, he doesn't really exist anymore. He's chosen to go into the quote unquote real world. And that requires him to be removed from this more magical realm. This just gets going. A, it's really sad. B, it's once again a great utilization of familial dynamic to explore these big ideas, but it's also just like, what a fucking perfect way to end what in a lot of ways is a very successfully self chapter story.
Yeah.
But that still builds the rest of the book.
I just have a single turn of phrase to highlight because I think it's truly masterful. Only the goodbye letter waiting this morning on her work table, held now like a crushed handkerchief in her pocket, in which he had given her his heart.
Yeah.
Again, from just a formal analysis, trying to keep the fact that is a heartbreaking idea out of it. It's also just like such a fascinating thing to pull off as a sentence, because it doesn't read as wild as it is. Because why is that the analogy? A crushed handkerchief that holds his heart. Why is that the analogy? Why does that make any sense? But it's perfect.
Yeah, it's man. He's such a great writer. I know that's like kind of the whole point of this podcast, but it's true. He's absolutely amazing.
Absolutely, yeah. And this is there are a handful of books. I'm just going to stick with books in this reference here, but there's a handful of books where I can remember very vividly where I was and what I was doing the first time I read, not necessarily the whole book, but maybe a part of it. And this is one of them. I can still remember being in my living room on the couch. It was a couch that we don't have anymore. but I can see everything as it was at that time, and I remember just reading this this paragraph, closing the book, and just saying, I don't know, I don't want to finish this book because it there's no way it can get better than this. And obviously I did, but it was just such a I had never read a book like that at that time. And so it was really a very momentous incident for me to experience that, and really opened up so many doors of different books to go and pick up. But it still hits me so hard. Um, it's so beautiful.
Any other thoughts from chapter 11 before we move into the wrap up segments?
Again, more of a comment on our own podcast than the book itself, but just the idea that one of your highlights for Pynchon's taking headiness out of the narrative, the fact that what you pointed to was something which I think is a self-conscious. Not only was the line intolerably slow, often it did not move for 15 minutes, but when it did move, it ratcheted ahead only a fraction of the space a single body would occupy.
Mm-hmm.
Just in the context of all the hard mathematics and the talking around the quantum breakthrough.
That's a good point.
No, it's that level of weird little puns are just strewn throughout this entire chapter. That take that degree of familiarity to catch them, and I'm sure I've missed so many.
Oh, it's so good. That line more than I think any other in this, except for maybe the chums of chance nearly crashing into the Kremlin, was what made me laugh really hard. And then my partner was in the room, and so she was like, "What's making you laugh so hard?" And I read it out loud to her, and then I literally was like, "It's like it's like the restaurant across from the cat." And she was like, "Yeah, that is how it is." And then immediately she followed that up with, "Well, I need to take you there now so you can experience it." So
you got to give us a report when you go.
I guess, yeah. Well, if there's no other funny parts, does anyone burning to go first on quotes?
Yeah, I can go first. I've got
Oh,
a reasonably short one that I might be stealing from someone, but I'm also not worried about it. So I'll just go.
Breaking new ground here.
On 134. The sun came up a baleful smear in the sky, not quite shapeless, in fact able to assume the appearance of a device immediately recognizable yet unnameable, so widely familiar that the inability to name it passed from simple frustration to a felt dread, whose intricacy deepened almost moment to moment. Its name a word of power, not to be spoken aloud, not even to be remembered in silence. All around lay ambushes of the bad ice, latent presences haunting all transactions, each like the infinitesimal circle converging toward zero that mathematicians now and then would find use for. A silver gray, odorless, silent exit from the upper world. The sun might be visible from time to time, with or without clouds, but the sky was more neutral density gray than blue. Out on the promontory grew some even-textured foliage, in this light a blazing, virtually shadowless green, and breaking down at the base of the headland was sea-green sea, ice-green, glass-green sea. It's got the good mathematical discursions and stuff that I've spent far too much time talking and thinking about this podcast. It's just really, really particularly beautiful, though.
It is. All the talk of bad ice, it's brought up there, but then also at the end. All of the talk of bad ice. Have any of you guys heard an ice quake?
No, but it sounds terrifying.
Oh, it is. It is. There was one that took place near where I live because we're nearby a lake that freezes every year. And it was so loud that there were people apparently calling the local police department reporting that they heard a bomb go off.
Jesus.
It is the strangest thing to just hear. And it's just from when the ice starts to crack, like when it starts to get warmer. It's and and that's not the only way that they happen. That's the way that it usually happens around here. And I don't think I will ever experience the like innate terror I felt the first time I heard one of those happen. It was
Only imagine.
crazy.
Yeah, and even when it's not calving, like a glacier will sometimes, it's like a landlocked one will just freak.
Mm-hmm.
And it's terrifying.
I will go next for quotes. This comes from the librarian's monologue. They have been crossing here, crossing over between the worlds for generations. Our ancestors knew them. Looking back over 1,000 years, there's a time when they're passing our shore and at last converge as in a vanishing point with those of the first Norse visitors. They arrive here in criminal frames of mind, much like those early Norsemen who were either fleeing retribution for offenses committed back where they came from or seeking new coastlines to pillage. Who in our excess of civilization strike us now is barbaric, incapable of mercy. Compared to these other trespassers, however, they are the soul of civility. This is one of those cases where, like, yes, there's a lot of thematic work being done in this quote, and it's a great encapsulation of sort of a lot of the stuff that exists in this chapter and as the book is told to this point. But there are moments in Pynchon's writing where he'll talk about something or he'll have a character deliver something like this that just like fills my head with an overwhelming amount of and also like a sense of history where like my head and my imagination can picture all of the sort of barbaric history that this librarian is talking about. And the way in which that is delivered is in such a poetic frame of reference that it's just one of these things that like maybe the specific word choices or whatever are breathtaking, but the sense that it imparts and the imagery that it imparts certainly is. And it is another aspect of Finch really and it comes up in pretty big moments.
Yeah, so mine comes from 129. It's right after the section break. Built only a few years before, and a clapboard siding of a vivid cream color, roofed in gray shakes, a shade or two lighter than the outcroppings and stone walls that surrounded it. The Hotel Borealis, where the expedition had set up headquarters, presented at one corner a curious sort of open turret, whose slender white columns supported semicircular balconies on the first and second floors, and above them held up a conical roof, almost a steeple, with a high finial that carried a weather vane and some wireless antennas as well. In the back of the hotel rose a steep green mountainside. Mist seethed and glided everywhere. At the end of the lane began the fjord, sudden and deep. I just have a really easy time picturing that. I mean, not necessarily the Hotel Borealis as much, just the setting of it. And there are probably sections of this chapter that are more beautiful, but that's just kind of my favorite imagery of the chapter.
It's a really good one too. Well, I'm going with the very last paragraph because no one else did. So
That would have been my other one if someone had taken mine. It's
yeah,
great.
if someone else had taken it, I was going to do the section where they are traveling through the membrane of dimensions by looking at the parrot on the
Oh
saucer
yeah.
bottle. But yeah, I'll end it on this. About mid-morning, Constance went to the ridgetop, looked down the long declivity, down the shorn hills, and saw the miniature ship that had once lain waiting there, secured only by the lightest of kedgework to the harbor bed, seeing sometimes to tremble with its desire to be away, had gone at last, bound for seas more emerald, aromatic winds, hammocks out on deck. Up here, the view of the sea continued as gray as ever, the wind no colder than usual, perhaps a minimum austerity of growth, all in shades of white, buff, and gray, pale grasses, failing by a visible margin to be green, bending to the wind together, a million stalks, all held to the same exact angle, which no scientific instrument would measure. She looked to every horizon, taking her time, saving south for last. Not a wisp of smoke, not the last wind-muted cry of a steam siren. Only the goodbye letter, waiting this morning on her work table, held now like a crushed handkerchief in her pocket, in which he had given her his heart. But she could not open it again and read it, for fear that through some terrible magic she had never learned to undo, it might have become, after all, a blank sheet. Just tremendous. It's just phenomenal writing.
Yep. Perfect way to end the chapter.
Mm-hmm.
I already said my most pinch as we were going through chapter itself. So
Mm-hmm.
what is y'all's most?
I know it's kind of a cop out, but it's the whole thing. Everything's here.
Just the
It's
whole chapter.
the whole the complex math, the highbrow lowbrow humor of the salsa jokes, the beautiful scene setting, the mysticism and unknown elements that are lurking in the background, the references to Norse mythology, the history behind everything, the subtle references to things like the wasteland. I mean, everything's here, and it was like for me to pick just one, I feel like is just doing a disservice to the chapter as a whole. So I'm going to take the easy route and say the whole thing.
Fair.
Mine is probably the all the stuff about or the Tetris reference, and then the falling bricks and stuff. Which I didn't actually put together until we were talking about it today, because I did read the Pynchon Wiki, but I just didn't. I didn't reread. I read the Pynchon Wiki after having read the 2 chapters that we were going to do, so it was just kind of lost on me that the stuff. I had forgotten about the falling bricks. But that's just a very like nerdy and like Pynchon type thing to include in a book.
Yeah. Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Young William.
Young William is going to choose basically just the whole idea of setting up the Ray Rush as a concept, as a part of the setting. That's for all the reasons I talked about a lot earlier in this episode. That's what I'm going with. Although it feels like less of a hack. My first thought was to choose that central bit that starts on 126 with the Etienne Louis Malus and ends with Crystal Choked Cave 2 pages later. Since Cody took the whole chapter, it feels like less of a cop out.
Yep. I walked so you could run.
Not sure that you ran so that I could look graceful by falling over.
Yeah, there you go.
You ran so Will could go, damn, he's fast.
Oh my god. Look how far he goes.
Look at that.
As usual, we have received some correspondence from our listeners on our various channels. First one is an email that we got from Henry, listening in from Australia. He says, "Hello, chums of Pynchon. I discovered your podcast several weeks ago after finally finishing Against the Day. Hurrah! After about a year on and off. Following publication of Vineland, I found my speed of reading Mr. Pynchon overtaken by his speed of publishing novels, hard as it is for me to believe. After listening to your introductory episode of March 2023 for general orientation, I played the first episode of Against the Day series. I found the podcast quite irritating, very long, and the dynamics between the presenters ridiculous. So I looked further at the other reviews of many by esteemed reviewers at esteemed newspapers and periodicals. They were irritating and stupid. Many of the critics were criticizing Mr. Pynchon for not writing differently, or not giving them the youthful thrill they believe they experience when reading an early, or not writing a different book more to their liking, and so forth. And then the academic criticism. Remind me, oh goodness, oh how dreary they were, stripped of all joy and fun, reducing Mr. Pynchon's text to some particular ridiculous mono-theme on which they hope to be published. Pass me a stimulant or perhaps stick of dynamite now. So, still needing to process Against the Day with like-minded folk, I returned with ambivalence to your podcast series. Do I really want to hear 4, sometimes fewer, individuals competing to get in their idiosyncratic free associations, favorite passages, evidence of their historical researches, deeply personal asides, references to themes from other Pynchon books, and so forth over about 7 fucking hours to cover only about 7 fucking pages of the book? Yes, turns out I do. It slowed me down, appreciate the poetry of Mr. Pynchon's language, to recall the long character arcs, and to very much better understand the historical context in which these wacky events take place, and so forth. The perfectly imperfect vehicle that you are floating, by design, or arising from the personal qualities of the presenters, avoids what Mr. Harstad put his finger on in his take on the controversy about the region translation. The hubris of the "I'm a bigger fan than you are" dynamic, and warmly invites us all to climb aboard. Good work, chums. Yours, Chumley, Henry. Sydney, Australia, not Canada. Thank you for that email. I I think that if there was a way to properly describe what we, I guess, are trying to do with this show, I couldn't think of a better endorsement than your second to last paragraph. As far as or sorry, third to last paragraph maybe. As far as how our podcast is. Yes, it is for sometimes fewer individuals competing with their idiosyncratic free associations' favorite passages, evidence of historical research, deeply personal asides, references to themes from other books, and so forth, over about 7 fucking hours to cover only about 7 fucking pages of the book. I think that might be, if we had the space for it in the intro, just how we would describe this book and this podcast instead of a highly fixated review of a large, dense book.
Hey, we got through like 28 pages in 4 hours today, so that's pretty good.
That's true. That is
we made
true.
progress.
I think all of us are sort of in agreement with the idea that our podcast is as long as it is, and that we have not just the audience that we do have, but an audience.
Mm-hmm.
Is pretty exciting to all 4 of us.
Yeah. I remember seeing this email and thinking, like, did I like get inside my own head and self-deprecatingly write this email to myself? Because it's absolutely, like, at times I'm like, Jesus, we talk way too much, but then maybe we kind of have to. Like, we're making good points, I think. But genuinely, thank you. Like, I
Yes.
don't want anyone to think that we ever take ourselves too seriously on this, and that's never been our goal. I'm completely with you on the hubris of the "I'm a bigger fan than you" dynamic. I think that's really catastrophic to the fandom, and it really can be off-putting for people who are coming into it and get the impression that the people who are reading these works are these self what's the word I'm looking for? Like, really just
Self-serious?
self-serious and congratulatory, and think that they're the greatest people in the world because they can read these complex books. And anybody can read these books. Genuinely, anybody can. Does it take a little work? Sure, but anybody can, and I think everybody should, or at least should try it. It's not definitely for everybody, but we've also never tried to come at this from an academic standpoint. I think we went over that in our first episode, which, thank you for listening to that and then continuing on, 'cause it was a rough one. But we made the conscious decision when we started the show that this was always going to be an informal discussion. It has always been just us talking about, this is what we think, this is what we feel, this is how we interpret this. It's never going to be a sort of objective, mono idyllic idea of, this is exactly what this book is about, or this is exactly what this is about. As I said earlier, art is subjective, and it's framed and viewed through the lens of everybody and their experiences, which are all unique and individual. So no one can claim that they have the one true interpretation of this unless they wrote the book. And
Right.
And if that's the case,
That guy doesn't talk.
Again, you are absolutely welcome on the show anytime. We don't even have to record it. If you want to just come talk to us, I'm more than happy to do that. But genuinely, thank you so much. Like, I really enjoyed this email, and I had to go back and reread it a few times. And I'm glad that you were able to find some joy in what we're doing, and that you can put up with our long-winded episodes, which this is definitely one of. And we look forward to maybe hearing from you again in the future. So thank you, Henry.
Yeah, write in anytime, Henry.
We also got an email from Nick, He says, "Hi guys, I love the pod. Been working on my way through Pynchon's bibliography. Started with Crying of Lot 49, Inherent Vice, and then Gravity's Rainbow, and have really enjoyed reading along with your coverage of Vineland and Bleeding Edge. I've recently started Against the Day, and even though I plan on finishing it before you do, I'll be catching every episode. That aside, while I've been reading and listening along, it occurs to me that Foley's sense of the market is like an amplified version of what Horst does in Bleeding Edge. It also felt similar to Miles' sense of cards and the language of the Inner Earthers, just stronger and more exact than either of them. It could have to do with his lead lobotomy, removing any ego in the way, or potentially a human sense that, like the closing of the portal to the Inner Earth, is something that fades away with modernity. I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts on that. Another thing, Vineland related, I had a different read on the ending that I wanted to share. When Brock gets picked up by Blood and Vato, it seemed to me that they take him straight to hell. Earlier in the book, we get a description of hell and the underworld being in a cave in Vineland, and they pick him up and drive him directly into one. I know we don't see what happens to the Thanatoids to get them to Vineland, but I kind of assumed they just picked them up and dropped them off at the Thanatoid village. Anyways, hope you all are well. You've made reading Pynchon even more fun than it was before. Thanks, Nick. That's really nice. I regarding the thing with Foley, I think that's something I touched on in that chapter. The idea that there's some sort of modulation that's occurred in his brain, along with which of the chums is it that has the? Is it Lindsay that speaks in
Miles.
tongues now?
Miles.
Sorry, Miles. Thank you. And it's right there in the email too. I definitely, I think there's a through line with them, and I think that there is a connection that the events that have happened to them have caused them to sort of gain this quote unquote power. I hadn't ever connected that with Horst, so that's interesting. I'm going to have to think on that one, and I'm sure Kate might be able to speak more to that since she's kind of our bleeding edge expert.
Yeah, no, I think that I I think that you're definitely onto something in relation to how there are certain people at certain times that seem to just be able to pick up on vibrations of the market or market forces or trends and things like that. I would invite you to consider the idea that there is a lot of work in Bleeding Edge depicting the idea that this event was precipitated in the minds of so many people ahead of time. Not in the sense that they knew that the Twin Towers would fall, but they knew something was going on. That there was some sort of vibe in the air or something in the water or something like that that led people to know that they needed to get out of town. And of course, there's the conspiracy aspect of it too. That like the rich people who knew probably just knew what was happening. There's certainly the access to information that all of the waspy people in that book have, given that we actually talk to one of them, and that Horst is keyed into that. That could be an outgrowth of sort of that same idea. The fact that he has kind of this ability to tap into the market. But my understanding to this point is that it has been more as an outgrowth of that idea. That 9/11 was such a history-breaking event that took place that it was something that was picked up on by everybody because of its significance, or at least a good chunk of people. And that if you are looking at history from a narrative perspective, it would make sense that something like 9/11 as some sort of repayment for hubris that America engaged in arming the Mujahideen, whatever lane you want to look at it in. But I do agree that you are onto something in the comparison between those two characters. It is potentially something to do with that removal of ego, in the sense that Horst comes from the Midwest, which is considered to be like a more egoless area of the country, but he does still have his problems. He's an abusive husband. He does have a lot of issues with his own personality and his own mannerisms. And you take it a step further, all the way further in a sense, to the lobotomization that we have with the character in Against the Day, and maybe that's how you end up with his particular level of key. But that's prior to your email. The understanding that I always had of Horst specifically, and his function of his ability to key into market forces in that.
Yeah, I would just like to say, first of all, we love America. We believe everything in the 9/11 Commission report. There was no ambiguity, nothing suspect at all about any of the events around that
Correct.
happening. We are proud patriots.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that I don't know if I agree with your idea that necessarily it is not a human sense. Because I look at the character of Miles Blundell or Horst, and I see nothing inhuman about it, either of them. But that aside, thank you for the email, and I like what you're talking about, because especially the Vineland stuff, it makes sense.
Yeah, the Vineland comment you left was very good. I
Yeah.
enjoy that interpretation of Blood and Vato taking Brock to hell.
Yeah, I was gonna say I didn't link it to the talk about the cave and the underworld being in the cave, but I think I do remember talking about how at least one of us was talking about how like Brock clearly dies and stuff. I don't think any of us linked it to him going to hell specifically. Um, I do remember that part of the book being pretty hard to parse, and there's not a lot to there's not a lot of concrete information to hold on to. It's almost like a montage of kind of seemingly perhaps unrelated events happening to Brock, or we're not. It's unclear like how Blood and Vato would cross over into the afterlife or how they were involved in Brock's death and stuff. But I really like that interpretation as well. Yeah. So on YouTube, on the Against the Day Part 1, I assume it's the wrap-up episode, Ellen Robinson 6381 commented, "I was ignorant. Thank you for the education." We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
I do think that comment could perhaps just be I mean, Ellen, feel free to correct me, but that comment could just be about we were a little bit confused as to how we educated you with that particular episode, but it did occur to me that Ellen could be just talking about all of the historical context we provided in the episodes leading up to the wrap up episode. That maybe she finished that first kind of section of episodes, and was commenting on the entire Against Today coverage that came before it. But yeah, I mean, whatever you were referring to in terms of us educating you, that's obviously part of our goal is to provide historical context and just kind of context in general. So we really appreciate it.
Yeah, we appreciate your prostration as well. You were ignorant. I'm sorry. There's a bitter monster deep inside me, and he needs to say things sometimes. Also on YouTube, but on the slow learner intro and small rain discussion, Nick Dreisen 6702 wrote, "Love it. Thanks for all the work, guys, and you're welcome. So you didn't prostrate yourself enough. So not appreciated."
That'd be a lesson to all of you. Prostrate better.
Indeed. You're listening to us, and you're writing comments to us. You are subordinating yourself. Acknowledge it, or don't. Probably please don't.
It doesn't matter.
Oh man. So that that brings us to the end of this episode. This episode was initially going to be covering 11 and 12, but
Now you know why it's only 11.
yeah, given that we're clocking in at a cool 4 hours of raw audio, we definitely weren't going to include chapter 12. So our next episode is going to be covering chapters 12 to 15. As usual, if you are someone who's working the different pagination, the quote that we are going to be ending on is Hunter was on his way to come to mean anymore in this world fought low. And we will see you to cover those chapters in a couple of weeks. If you think our show's worth $1, we'd love to have it. If you like what we're doing and you want to support the show, please consider making a donation to Ko-Fi. Any funds that we do receive will be used to upgrade equipment, pay hosting fees, and make the show better. And you can reach out to us, much like these listeners did over the past couple weeks, on any number of cool platforms out there in the world. You can go oldest and email us. It's the oldest platform we're on. And that's mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. And then we are on Twitter for mostly just show updates. There's not going to be a ton of information beyond sort of schedules and the kind of bare necessities for people to know, but you can message us there. And we are on Twitter, John Pod. We are also on Instagram at Mapping the Zone Podcast. And then we are on the newest social media platform, Blue Sky, at https://bsky.app/profile/mappingthezone.bsky.social.
Put that in Google and you'll find us right away.
Yep. I don't know what it is with Blue Sky just not showing up, but that's the whole hippus that you can type in. Additionally, a brief shout out to Brad Wetzel. You can find his artwork at Brad Per Second on Instagram and Reddit. He designed a new show cover for us, so the new artwork that you see comes from him. We are super excited to have been able to partner with him for that. This show is really born in the Reddit community for Thomas Pynchon, and Brad has been a huge part of that community for basically the entirety. So getting some artwork from him for our show has been really cool. If you love that design and want to buy some merch, I will say that you can with a precautionary statement. At the moment, we have stickers and T-shirts. For some godforsaken reason, the stickers print in only the corner of the actual printable area. We don't know why, but the only part that peels off is the printed area. So real strange Tesseract stuff going on over there at Spreadshirt. And then we do have a T-shirt that is comically too small, and is also comically printed in the sense that the logo is in a random quadrant of the shirt. If you want an explainer for that, you could go to our Blue Sky. But if you do order a T-shirt, order a couple sizes larger than you actually normally wear. As Cody bought himself a shirt, and that is now being worn by his daughter and not him.
It was a large. I bought it in large, and it fits my 10-year-old daughter quite well.
We are going to be working out some of those product kinks if we can. Please do understand if you do buy something that Spreadshirt is somebody who does print on demand work for stuff that gets uploaded. So that is sort of where we are at with the podcast. And yeah, I think that's pretty much all of the housekeeping we have as far as the show goes. So please email us on anything that we talked about on this episode or that we've ever talked about. You can also just email us for fun. We like music and TV and all sorts of stuff, so we're happy to chat with you.
Really,
I'm rambling right now. At this point, I'm just rambling because my brain is mush. So we'll see you guys in the next episode where we'll cover chapters 12 and 13. And I already said the rest of the detail that matters there. So goodbye.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.